A $50 bill lay face up on the concrete. Not dropped. Thrown. Tossed at the feet of a man in oil-stained boots like you'd toss a scrap to a stray dog. 12 aerospace engineers had already walked away from that jet in defeat. Men with advanced degrees, expensive tools, and corporate expense accounts. And the woman who'd thrown the money was watching the newcomer with the kind of smile that belonged to people who had never once lost anything they actually wanted to keep. 5 minutes, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Start my engines and I'll write you a check for $5 million. Nobody standing on that tarmac believed he could do it. What nobody knew yet, including him, was that the real danger had nothing to do with a broken engine. If this story hits you somewhere real, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this thing travels. Hit like, stay until the very end. Because what happens next is not what any of us expected. The morning Mason Ryder drove out to Terminal 7's private hangar complex. He wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the water heater. It had gone out again the night before, right when his daughter Callie was mid-shower, and she'd come downstairs wrapped in a towel and furious in that particular way only 16-year-olds can manage. Equal parts genuine frustration and theatrical performance. He'd promised to fix it by Thursday. It was already Wednesday. The replacement part was sitting in the back of his truck under 3 boxes of actuator housings he was supposed to deliver to Hangar 14B by 8 in the morning, which meant he had exactly 11 minutes to make it happen, or get a call from dispatch that would ruin the rest of his week. That was the full scope of Mason Ryder's ambitions on the morning his life changed. He wasn't a man who carried himself like someone waiting for destiny. He was 5'11", lean in a way that came from moving constantly, rather than lifting weights, with calloused hands and the kind of posture that develops from years of crawling into tight engine compartments. His jacket, the brown canvas one with the fraying right cuff, had been with him since his last deployment. He'd meant to replace it for about 4 years now. The truck rattled through the service gate and Mason waved at the security officer without stopping, because Oscar knew him by now, and the wave was the whole transaction. He'd been running parts out to this section of the airport for going on 3 years, long enough to know which hangars had good coffee and which ones had the kind of institutional drip that tasted like it had been sitting since the previous administration. Hangar 14B was not a coffee hangar. He found the loading dock and started moving boxes, working fast and quiet the way he always did, signing the delivery tablet with his usual illegible scratch. The receiving tech, a young guy named Phil, who wore his headphones around his neck instead of on his ears, barely looked up. "You hear about the circus?" Phil said. Mason stacked the last box. "What circus?" "Sterling Jet, Base 7, been down since yesterday afternoon, and apparently the woman herself flew in last night and has been losing her mind ever since." Phil finally looked up. 12 guys couldn't figure it out. It's all over the service channel. Mason didn't say anything to that. He picked up the empty dolly and started back toward the truck. "Hey, Ryder," Phil called after him. "Isn't that your kind of thing? Military aircraft systems, right?" "Used to be," Mason said, and kept walking. He almost left. He was in the truck, engine running, already running the route to his next delivery in his head. He had a 9:15 in the North Terminal and a noon pickup that required actual paperwork. He didn't need to go anywhere near Base 7. There was no rational reason to. He went anyway. Later, he would have trouble explaining why, even to himself. Maybe it was the mechanic's itch, that particular curiosity that lives in anyone who's ever been good with machines, the need to understand why something isn't working. Maybe it was something simpler. Maybe it was just that he turned left instead of right at the internal service road and found himself rolling slowly past Base 7 with the windows down and the unmistakable sound of an argument drifting out through the open hangar doors. He parked the truck. He sat there for a moment listening. Then he got out. The scene inside the hangar was the kind of controlled chaos that happens when very expensive people are very publicly failing. There were at least 20 people clustered around a $70 million Gulfstream G800, cream exterior with a thin gold stripe along the fuselage, the kind of aircraft that makes other private jets feel inadequate. Maintenance carts were positioned at both engine nacelles. A laptop on a rolling stand showed diagnostic readouts that Mason could see were inconclusive from 15 feet away. 3 men in matching company polos were having a heated, low-voiced conversation near the nose. Two others were on phones. A woman in a gray suit was taking photos of the engine access panels with an expression that suggested the photos were for lawyers rather than engineers. And then there was Victoria Sterling. Mason had seen her face before, on a magazine cover at the dentist's office, he thought, or maybe on a business news segment playing in the background at the parts warehouse. She was 30, he knew that much, which meant she'd built a company worth north of $70 million before most people had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. She was shorter than he'd expected, though he couldn't have said why he expected anything at all. Dark hair pulled back efficiently. She was wearing what looked like travel clothes, pressed but not formal, the kind of outfit that said, "I came here directly from somewhere more important." She stood near the main boarding stairs with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was past frustration and well into something colder. Mason stopped at the edge of the hangar bay and studied the aircraft. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He was just looking. He looked for about 90 seconds. "Can I help you?" A man in a company polo, older with the particular authority of someone whose job title included the word senior, appeared at Mason's elbow. His tone made clear that help was the last thing being offered. "No," Mason said. "Just looking." "This is a private hangar. Are you with maintenance?" "No." "Then I'm going to have to ask you to—" "Your fuel control unit is misbehaving," Mason said. The man stopped. "Probably the FADEC system is throwing an error that's preventing engine initialization. The diagnostic on that laptop," Mason nodded toward the rolling stand, "is reading the symptom, not the cause. You're looking at the engines when you should be looking at the control architecture." The senior polo man stared at him for a moment with an expression that went through several stages before settling on cautious contempt. "We have 12 certified avionics engineers who have been over this aircraft since yesterday." "I can see that," Mason said, without heat. "How's that going?" That was probably the wrong thing to say. He knew it as soon as it came out, but there it was. The conversation attracted attention the way small confrontations always do in contained spaces. Heads turned. The low-voiced argument near the nose stopped, and Victoria Sterling, who had been staring at a tablet screen with focused displeasure, looked up. She walked over with the unhurried pace of someone who owns the room she's walking through, regardless of whose name is on the lease. "Who is this?" she asked the polo man, but she was looking at Mason. "Parts delivery," the polo man said. "He was just leaving." "Parts delivery," she repeated. She looked at Mason the way people look at things that have appeared somewhere unexpected and slightly inconvenient. A coffee stain on a white shirt, a crack in a phone screen. Her gaze moved from his face to his jacket, to his boots, to his hands, and back up again in about 2 seconds, and he knew exactly what she was seeing and exactly what conclusion she was drawing. He'd spent 12 years in the Air Force and 5 years after it running a repair operation that kept other people's aircraft in the sky. He knew what he looked like. He'd long since stopped being bothered by what other people thought of what he looked like. Mostly. "He says he knows what's wrong with the aircraft," the polo man said, with the tone of a man reporting something faintly absurd. "Does he?" Victoria's voice was flat. She reached into the breast pocket of her jacket and produced a bill. She held it out, and when Mason didn't immediately take it, she dropped it, just opened her fingers and let it fall. It landed at his feet. $50. Face up. "For your trouble," she said, "and whatever it is you think you know." The hangar had gone quiet. Not completely. There were still phones and equipment and the distant sound of aircraft outside. But the human noise had dropped off in the way it does when people sense something worth watching. Mason was aware of 20 pairs of eyes without looking at any of them. He looked at the bill on the concrete. He looked at her. "Keep it," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not much. A slight recalibration. "I'm not interested in the money," Mason said. "But if you want your aircraft airworthy, I can walk you through what's causing the issue. No charge." "No charge," she said, like the concept was mildly foreign. "No charge." Victoria Sterling studied him for a long moment. "What's your background?" 12 years USAF. Crew chief and avionics specialist. F-16S primarily, some C-17 work. I run an aircraft repair operation now. He didn't mention the size of the operation. The size was not relevant to whether he was right. And you looked at my aircraft for... She glanced at the Polo Man. Maybe 2 minutes, the Polo Man said, with a slight smile that Mason understood was meant to be unflattering. 2 minutes, Victoria said. And you've identified what 12 certified engineers missed. I identified what I think it is, Mason said. I could be wrong. I don't think I am. Confident for a parts delivery man. He didn't answer that. She picked up the bill. She held it between 2 fingers and looked at it, then looked at him, and something changed in her face, some private calculation landing somewhere. When she smiled, it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has decided to be entertained. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. She raised her voice slightly, letting it carry to the edges of the hangar. If you can start my engines in 5 minutes, I'll pay you $5 million. She held up the 50. If you can't, you take this and go back to whatever it is you actually do. The hangar was very quiet. Mason Ryder looked at the aircraft. He looked at the woman holding a $50 bill and a smile that she was already composing the punchline for. He thought about the water heater. He thought about Callie coming downstairs in a wet towel, furious, and how she had that same energy her mother used to have, that absolute certainty that the universe owed her better than what it was currently providing, which was both an exhausting and a completely understandable position. He thought about 12 engineers who had given up. Get me access to the avionics bay, he said, and I need someone to pull up the FADEC fault log from the last 72 hours. Not the summary, the raw data. Nobody moved for a moment. Well, Victoria said to the Polo Man, you heard him. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 51 seconds was not dramatic in the way that dramas usually are. Mason didn't run. He didn't make speeches. He moved with the focused efficiency of someone who has performed emergency diagnostics under considerably more pressure than a private hangar audience, and the only sound he made was the occasional specific request. Open channel 2 on that interface. No. The second menu, not the first. There. Hold that. The issue was exactly what he'd suspected from the hangar door. A software fault in the FADEC control system had created a false positive in the engine protection protocol, triggering an automatic lockout that prevented initialization. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't even a particularly obscure fault. But it was the kind of thing you'd miss completely if you came at the problem looking for hardware damage, which was apparently what 12 engineers had spent 18 hours doing. There was a particular submenu in the diagnostic interface that required a specific key sequence to access. Mason knew the sequence because he'd worked on a civilian derivative of the same system during a contract job 3 years ago, and that job had ended with him reading the actual technical manual rather than the simplified maintenance guide, which was the kind of thing people did when they were being paid by the hour, and the kind of thing Mason did because not knowing things made him uncomfortable. He cleared the fault. He reset the initialization protocol. He stood back. Okay, he said to the tech who'd been assisting him. Try startup sequence now. The tech looked at the Polo Man. The Polo Man looked at Victoria. Victoria made a very small gesture with her chin. The tech ran the sequence. The engines came to life. The sound of a jet engine spooling up in an enclosed space is a physical thing. It moves through your chest before it reaches your ears. The hangar filled with it, and for a moment nobody said anything because nobody needed to. The diagnostic screens showed everything nominal. The engine settled into a steady idle that was, by any technical measure, exactly what they were supposed to sound like. Mason looked at the clock on the diagnostic console. 4 minutes, 38 seconds. He should have felt something uncomplicated in that moment. Vindication, maybe. The quiet satisfaction of being right. Instead, what he felt was a sudden cold unease that had nothing to do with the woman who'd thrown money at his feet or the crowd of engineers who were now looking at him with various expressions ranging from impressed to irritated. He felt it because he was looking at the data, not the startup data, the other data, the stuff that had been sitting in the raw fault log while everyone else was focused on whether the engines would turn over. He stepped closer to the screen and stared at what he was seeing. Then he looked at the engine access panels that the maintenance crews had left open. Then he looked at the fuel system readouts on the secondary display, the ones nobody had been paying attention to because the primary problem had seemed sufficient. Something was wrong. Not with the engine he'd just fixed. with the aircraft. Something was wrong with the aircraft in a way that had nothing to do with a software fault, and the more he looked at it, the more certain he became. And the certainty felt less like professional satisfaction and more like the particular feeling he'd had exactly twice before, once in a maintenance bay in Bagram and once during a pre-flight check in Ramstein. The feeling that preceded the moment someone said, "Stand down, we're grounding this aircraft." "Ms. Sterling," he said. She was already walking toward him, and she was smiling in the way people smile when they've just lost a bet they didn't actually expect to lose but find they don't entirely mind. There was something almost genuine in it for a moment. Almost. "Mr. She paused. "Ryder," he said. "Mason Ryder." "Mr. Ryder." She stopped beside him. "It appears I owe you a rather significant sum of money." She glanced at the engines. "Color me surprised." "You can't fly this aircraft," Mason said. The smile didn't disappear exactly. It reconfigured. "I beg your pardon." "The engines are running," he said, "but the aircraft has other problems, serious ones." He turned back to the diagnostic screen and pointed. "This is the fuel flow telemetry from the last 48 hours. You see these anomalies here? This pattern? That's not normal wear variance. And the fault log I pulled..." He scrolled to a section of the raw data and pointed again. "These entries were cleared manually, not auto-archived. Someone manually deleted fault records." The hangar had gone quiet again, but it was a different quiet this time. "What are you saying?" Victoria's voice had changed. The social layer had come off it. "I'm saying someone removed maintenance records from this aircraft, and I'm saying there are modifications to the fuel management system that shouldn't be there." Mason made himself keep his voice flat and even because this was not a moment for emotion. "I'm saying that if this aircraft takes off today, I cannot tell you with confidence that it comes back." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then the polo man's voice cut through it with the sharp, decisive tone of someone who has decided that offense is the best available posture. "That is an extraordinary accusation." "I'm not making an accusation," Mason said. "I'm reporting what I'm seeing in the data." "What you're seeing?" The polo man stepped forward. His name, Mason would later learn, was Gerald Foss, and his title was Director of Operations, and he had been with Sterling Aerospace for 9 years, long enough that the distance between his opinions and facts had become difficult for him to locate. "You've been in this hangar for 5 minutes. Our engineering team has been over this aircraft thoroughly. They were looking for a different problem. And now you're claiming you found sabotage." Foss let the word land with deliberate weight, let it sit there so everyone could look at it. "On an aircraft that was seconds ago perfectly functional." "I didn't say sabotage," Mason said. "I said the fault records were manually deleted and there are unauthorized modifications to the fuel system. You can call that whatever you want." "What I'm going to call it," Foss said, "is convenient." He looked at Victoria Sterling with the practiced expression of a man who has learned to read his employer and deploy what she needs before she knows she needs it. He asked for access to our systems, our security credentials, our raw data. He turned back to Mason. "And now, having failed to find any existing mechanical fault to claim credit for, because our engineers had already addressed those issues, he's inventing a new crisis to stay relevant." Mason stared at him. He had been in enough situations to know when he was being handled. The particular quality of Foss's argument, its speed, its preformed shape, the way it assembled itself too quickly for genuine reasoning, told him that this wasn't a man responding to information. This was a man deploying a prepared defense for something he already knew about. Or it was a man protecting his turf with the first available weapon. Both were possible. Mason had learned the hard way not to assign conspiracy to what might simply be institutional arrogance. "Pull the maintenance logs for the last 6 months," Mason said to Victoria. Not to Foss. To her. "Not the summary logs, the originals, with access timestamps. If I'm wrong, it'll take 10 minutes to prove it, and we're done." Victoria Sterling looked at him. She had very still eyes. Not cold exactly, but controlled in a way that made you uncertain what was actually happening behind them. She'd been quiet since Foss started speaking, and that quiet had a quality to it that Mason couldn't quite read. "Gerald," she said. Foss turned to her. "Contact our security team," she said. and have Mr. Ryder escorted from the premises. Mason held her gaze for a moment. He had an irrational impulse to argue, to push back, to make the case harder, louder. He recognized the impulse and set it aside, the way he'd been setting aside bad impulses since he was 22 years old and his crew chief had told him that the most dangerous thing in aviation wasn't mechanical failure, it was a man who confused being right with being effective. He said calmly, "You should ground the aircraft." Then he let security escort him out. He was in the parking lot, sitting on the hood of his truck in the early morning heat, looking at the service road and not really seeing it, when his phone started ringing. It was his shop manager, a 37-year-old former Army aviation mechanic named D. Novak, who communicated exclusively in blunt declarative sentences, and who he trusted more than almost anyone he knew. "There's a news van outside," D said. Mason took his sunglasses off and rubbed his eyes. "What?" "Parked on the service road out front, and I've got 3 messages from clients who want to know what's going on. Something about you and the Sterling jet." A pause. "Mason, what did you do?" "I fixed a jet," he said, "and then I told them not to fly it." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," D said, "so why are people calling us to say they're canceling their service appointments?" He didn't have an answer for that yet. The news, it turned out, travels faster than he'd expected, and in directions he hadn't predicted. By noon, there were 2 stories running simultaneously on the regional business news channels. The first was about a small-time parts contractor who had solved a problem that stumped 12 aerospace engineers and won a $5 million bet, framed as a quirky human interest angle, the underdog story that writes itself. The second was about allegations that a mechanic with questionable credentials had exploited access to a billionaire CEO's private aircraft and was now fabricating a safety crisis to extend his 15 minutes. The 2 stories ran side by side. The second one was more interesting to more people. By 2 in the afternoon, Mason had fielded 4 calls from journalists, none of which he answered. He'd received a formal letter via email, delivered with a speed that suggested it had been drafted before the morning was over, from Sterling Aerospace's legal department, informing him that access credentials he'd used to pull the fault log had been registered under a security clearance that had been suspended. The letter stopped short of explicitly accusing him of anything, but it didn't need to. The implication was architectural, built into every carefully chosen word. He read the letter 3 times. Then he forwarded it to the only lawyer he knew, a woman named Patricia Eng, who'd helped him with a contract dispute 18 months ago, and who, when he called her and explained the situation, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't talk to anyone, don't post anything, don't explain yourself to journalists, and get me everything you have from that diagnostic session in writing, with timestamps." "The credentials," Mason said. "I used the text credentials. He offered them. He was right there." "I know," Patricia said. "That's a problem. Don't talk to anyone." He picked up Callie from school at 3:15. She got in the truck and looked at him with the narrow-eyed assessment she'd been doing since she was about 12, the one that said she was reading him whether he wanted her to or not. "You look weird," she said. "Thanks." "Not bad weird, just—" She searched for it. "Concentrated, like when you're working through something." "Rough day." "I heard." She held up her phone. On the screen was a news article. The headline read, "Parts runner or con artist? Contractor's bizarre stunt at Sterling hangar raises questions." Below the headline was a photo that someone had taken on the tarmac outside the hangar, Mason walking toward the service gate with 2 security guards, which in context looked considerably worse than it had been. He stared at the photo for a moment. "Dad," Callie said, in the careful voice she used when she was trying not to be alarmed and wanted him to know she wasn't alarmed, but also was maybe a little alarmed. "What happened?" He drove for a block before answering. "I fixed a jet, and I found something I wasn't supposed to find." He glanced at her. "I don't know yet what it means, but I know what I saw." "Do you?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. The way she asked things when she wanted to understand rather than when she wanted to win. She'd gotten that from him. Maybe the only completely good thing he'd passed on. "Yeah," he said. "I do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." She put her phone away. "What do we do?" He thought about the fault log. The manually deleted records. The fuel system anomalies that were subtle enough that you'd miss them if you weren't looking, and specific enough that they couldn't be accidental. He thought about Gerald Foss and the preformed shape of his argument, and the speed with which security had appeared. He thought about Victoria Sterling's eyes when she'd given the order to remove him, and how she'd looked less like someone who believed Foss and more like someone who was buying time to think. Or maybe he was wrong about that. Maybe he'd seen what he wanted to see. "I need to get my hands on those maintenance records," he said. "The real ones, not whatever they've been showing people." "Can you do that?" "I know someone who might be able to help." He thought of a name, someone he hadn't spoken to in about 8 months. Someone who worked in FAA compliance and had once told Mason over cheap beer that the aviation industry's record-keeping systems had more holes in them than the government liked to admit. Maybe. "And if you can't?" He pulled into their street. The news van Dee had mentioned was gone. At least, maybe they'd decided the story wasn't worth a stakeout at a small repair shop in a light industrial neighborhood. "Then I'll figure out something else," he said. Callie looked at him. "That's not a plan." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She got out of the truck and walked toward the house, and at the door she turned back and said, in the tone she used when she was trying to sound casual and not succeeding, "I believe you, you know, about the jet." He sat in the truck for a moment after she went inside. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower was running. The afternoon sun was doing the thing it does in Texas in late spring, that particular heavy gold that turns the air almost solid. Mason Ryder sat there, and he thought about an aircraft that was sitting in a private hangar with its engines running and its maintenance records altered. And he thought about how many people might eventually get on that aircraft. And he thought about what he had seen in the fuel system data that had made the hair on his arms stand up. He thought about the feeling he'd had in Bagram and in Ramstein. Then he went inside to fix the water heater. He couldn't fix the other thing yet, but he could fix that. The water heater took 40 minutes and 2 stripped bolts and a burned knuckle on the exhaust pipe, which was about par for that particular appliance. Mason finished it around 8 in the evening, tested the hot water at the kitchen sink, and stood there with his hand under the faucet waiting for it to warm up, which it did, eventually, in the slow, reluctant way of things that have been broken longer than they should have been. Callie came downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway eating cereal directly from the box, watching him. "Fixed?" she said. "Fixed." "Good." She went back upstairs. He made coffee he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and spent 2 hours reading everything publicly available about Sterling Aerospace. Not the business profile stuff. He'd absorbed most of that in passing over the years, the way you absorb any name that moves through the aviation industry long enough. He was reading the operational side, the maintenance contracts, the aircraft management agreements, the publicly filed FAA compliance reports, which were accessible through the agency's online database if you knew where to look and had the patience to navigate a government website that appeared to have been designed sometime around 2009 and never substantially updated since. The reports were clean, conspicuously clean, in the particular way that records are clean when someone has paid attention to making them clean. Not a single deviation flag in 4 years. Not a single deferred maintenance notation. For a private fleet of that size and usage rate, that was either an extraordinary operational record or it was a record that had been managed. He wrote down 3 names from the compliance filings. The designated airworthiness representative, the lead maintenance supervisor on record, the FAA liaison contact listed for the Texas regional office. Then he stared at those names for a while. At 10:30, he called Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 51 years old, had spent 14 years as an FAA aviation safety inspector before moving to a private consulting firm that specialized in compliance audits, and had the specific personality type of a man who had spent his entire career being the person nobody wanted in the room, but everyone needed. Mason had met him through a military aviation conference 3 years back, and they'd had a conversation over bad hotel coffee that lasted 2 hours and covered everything from turbine blade fatigue analysis to what Marcus called the comfortable fiction of regulatory oversight, which was a phrase that had stayed with Mason because of the way Marcus had said it, not with bitterness, but with the resigned precision of someone reporting a weather condition. The phone rang 4 times. Then, "It's 10:30 at night, Ryder." "I know. I'm sorry." A pause, the sound of a television being muted. "I saw the news, both versions." "Then you know why I'm calling." "I know why you think you're calling," Marcus said. "You think you're calling because you found something and you want someone to validate it. But what you're actually calling about is the fact that they're going to come after you hard, and you want to know if the technical ground you're standing on is solid enough to hold your weight when they do." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's probably more accurate." "What did you actually see? Not what you told them. What you actually saw." Mason walked him through it. The FADEC fault data, the manually cleared records, the fuel flow telemetry anomalies, specifically the variance pattern in the left engine fuel delivery that was small enough to miss in a casual review, but consistent enough across multiple flight cycles that it couldn't be attributed to normal sensor drift. He described the access panel on the fuel management controller that had showed tool marks inconsistent with the documented service intervals. Marcus didn't say anything for a while after Mason finished. "The tool marks," Marcus said finally. "You're sure about those?" "I've been doing this for 17 years, yes." "And the fault log deletions? So you saw the timestamp metadata? The manual override indicator?" "Yes." Another pause. "Okay, here's the problem, Mason. Everything you just described. You saw it in a live diagnostic session with credentials that aren't yours, in a privately owned aircraft, in a situation where you've just won a $5 million bet from the aircraft's owner." Marcus let that sit for a moment. "You understand how that reads?" "I understand exactly how it reads. The tool marks are gone now. They've had all day to run whatever service they want on those panels. The fault log you accessed, if they've cleared it since this morning, your recollection of what it showed is your word against theirs." A long breath. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying the architecture of this thing is going to make being right very expensive for you." "I know. Do you have anything in writing? Anything you documented before you left the hangar?" "I took photos on my phone," Mason said. "The screen, the fault log, the telemetry data." A pause. Then, with the cautious tone of a man choosing words carefully, "Send them to me, tonight, before anything else changes, and send them to your lawyer with a note establishing the timestamp and context." Another pause. "And Mason?" "Yeah. Don't talk to the press. I know that feels like the wrong call right now, but trust me on this." He sent the photos at 11:15 to Marcus and to Patricia Eng, with a written summary of everything he'd observed, time-stamped, and as precise as he could make it. Then he sat back and looked at the kitchen ceiling, which had a water stain in the corner that he'd been meaning to deal with for about 6 months. He went to bed at midnight. He didn't sleep particularly well. The next 3 days were the kind that don't announce themselves as defining at the time. They just feel, while you're inside them, like a sustained low-grade emergency. Nothing acute enough to mobilize you fully, but nothing ordinary enough to set aside. By Thursday morning, 2 more clients had called to cancel service appointments. Dee reported it to him with her characteristic absence of softening. Rodriguez Aviation called. They're putting their contract on hold, pending resolution of the current situation. Those were their words. I wrote them down. A pause. We also got a call from someone who didn't leave a name and wanted to know if you'd been officially investigated. I told them we don't comment on operational matters and hung up. Good, Mason said. It's not good, Dee said. We're losing work. I know. I need to know if this is going to get worse before it gets better. Mason looked at the repair bay through the office window. One of his 2 other mechanics, a young guy named Torres, was working on a Cessna engine that needed new cylinder heads. Normal work. The kind of work that kept the lights on. Probably yes, he said. It's going to get worse first. Dee was quiet for a moment, then, okay, I just needed to know what I was dealing with. That was the thing about Dee Novak. She didn't ask for reassurance. She asked for information. The legal letter from Sterling Aerospace had been followed by a second communication on Wednesday, this one more explicit. It alleged that Mason had gained access to proprietary aircraft systems data by using a maintenance technician's credentials without authorization, and that this constituted a potential violation of both company security protocols and applicable federal aviation regulations. It did not say, in so many words that he had sabotaged anything. It didn't need to. The allegation was being assembled in public, piece by piece, through a much more efficient channel. The business channel that had run the original underdog mechanic story had updated its coverage. The new angle was more complicated and, Mason noticed, much more carefully sourced. Quotes from unnamed company insiders, references to irregularities in the contractor's access to sensitive systems, a line about the $5 million bet that had been reframed from an impressive display of expertise to a carefully staged demonstration. Someone had talked to journalists with a specific narrative in hand. The quotes were too structured, too consistent, too free of the kind of contradiction that appears in genuine witness accounts. He showed Patricia Eng the articles on a Thursday afternoon call. "They're building something," she said. Not surprised, just noting a fact. "Yeah. The credential issue is their strongest card. If they can establish that you used the text login without his explicit consent—" "He handed me the tablet," Mason said. "He was standing right there. He told me to use it." "Is he going to say that?" Mason thought about Phil, the young receiving tech with the headphones around his neck, the one who'd told him about the circus at Bay 7. He'd been in the hangar during the diagnostic session, but he'd been peripheral, and at a certain point Mason had stopped tracking where exactly Phil was standing. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what he's been told since then." "Find out," Patricia said. "Carefully. Don't contact him directly. If there's any appearance that you're coordinating testimony, it compounds the problem. But find out." The person who found out, eventually, was Marcus Webb. Marcus had contacts inside the regional FAA office, and more importantly, he had the particular kind of professional reputation that meant people returned his calls. He spent most of Thursday making those calls, not asking about Mason specifically, but asking about the Sterling aircraft, its maintenance history, its compliance filing status, whether any flags had been raised in the standard oversight process. By Thursday evening, he had something. He called Mason at 6:15. "The aircraft's maintenance records," Marcus said, without preamble. "The official ones filed with the regional FAA database. I had a colleague run a routine audit query." A pause. "They're different from what was filed 3 months ago." Mason went still. "What do you mean, different?" "I mean, the records have been updated since the last compliance check. Dates modified. Some entries removed. The kind of changes that would take administrative access to the filing system and a working knowledge of how to make alterations look like routine updates." That's the same pattern I saw in the aircraft's onboard logs." "Yes," Marcus said. "It is." "Can your colleague document it, the before and after?" "She's working on it. The original submission is archived. The system keeps versions. It's just not obvious how to access them unless you know the process." A pause. "Mason, this is bigger than a maintenance oversight issue. If someone altered FAA records, that's federal." "I know." "And whoever did it had access to both the aircraft systems and the regulatory filing infrastructure. That's not a junior employee acting alone." Mason sat with that for a moment. "Sterling's COO," he said. "Garrett Wills, his name is on the compliance authorization chain." "I noticed that too," Marcus said quietly. "Don't get ahead of the evidence, but yes." The name had surfaced in Mason's research on Wednesday night. Garrett Wills, who had been with Sterling Aerospace for 11 years, who had built the company's operational infrastructure from the ground up, and who occupied the specific position of a person whose institutional knowledge made him simultaneously invaluable and very difficult to scrutinize. COOs of privately held companies existed in a particular kind of organizational shadow. They ran the machinery while the CEO was the face, which meant that if something went wrong in the machinery, the CEO was often the last to know and the first to be publicly associated with the failure. Mason had spent enough time thinking about this to know he was getting ahead of himself. The evidence pointed towards something, but evidence pointing towards something was not the same as understanding what that something was. He'd learned that lesson in the Air Force, where the difference between a mechanical anomaly and a maintenance failure and actual sabotage were 3 different problems with 3 different solutions, and misidentifying one as another could get people killed. He needed to understand the why before he could be certain about the what. He went back to the publicly available information on Sterling Aerospace's recent business activity. There was a lot of it. The company had been in the financial news fairly consistently over the past 8 months because of a pending acquisition. Sterling was in the process of acquiring a regional aerospace manufacturing company called Hendrix Dynamics, a deal valued somewhere north of $2 billion that, according to the business coverage, was in the final stages of regulatory review and was expected to close within 6 to 8 weeks. Mason read about the Hendrix acquisition with growing attention. Hendrix Dynamics manufactured, among other things, aircraft fuel management systems. Their technology was used on a range of commercial and private aircraft platforms. They had contracts with 3 major aviation companies and had recently won a government defense contract that represented a significant expansion of their market position. The acquisition would make Sterling Aerospace a major player in avionics manufacturing, not just services, a qualitative shift in what the company actually was. It was also, Mason noted, the kind of deal that would require the acquiring company's safety record to survive intensive due diligence scrutiny. He wrote that down. He drew a line from it to the fuel management system anomalies he'd observed. He drew another line from it to the manually altered maintenance records. He sat looking at what he'd written and tried to find the reading that made the lines not connect. He couldn't find one. He called Marcus back. If the Sterling aircraft had a catastrophic incident, Mason said, in-flight fuel system failure, what happens to the Hendrix acquisition? Silence for a moment, then slowly. Depending on the investigation findings, if it traced back to a fuel management system failure on an aircraft that Sterling owned and operated, it could kill the deal. Any responsible board at Hendrix would walk away. The liability exposure alone would be... Marcus stopped. Mason. Yeah. You're saying someone wanted the aircraft to fail, not break down, fail. I'm saying the software modifications I saw in the fuel telemetry weren't designed to cause an obvious problem, Mason said. They were designed to suppress warning indicators during flight, which means the pilot would have no alert before the failure event. He paused. The diagnostic fault that grounded the aircraft, the FADEC issue, that was something else. That was a separate problem. Visible, addressable, the kind of thing that gets found and fixed, and the jet flies. And once it flies, Marcus said, following it, the hidden modification goes with it, the suppressed warnings go with it. And somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, or over a populated area, or wherever Victoria Sterling and her senior team happen to be flying to close a $2 billion deal, Mason stopped himself. The scenario assembled itself in his head with a clarity that was deeply unpleasant. You need to take this to the FAA, Marcus said. Formally. Not as an allegation, as a safety report. Use the aviation safety hotline, document everything, and file tonight. They're going to say I fabricated it. Some of them will, but a formal safety report creates a paper trail that's much harder to make disappear than a mechanic's verbal account. Marcus's voice had the flat urgency of someone who has worked in regulatory environments long enough to know how they move and how to move inside them. And Mason, the tech. Phil, I had a colleague reach out through a professional channel, nothing direct. He got a message back through a third party. A pause. The kid didn't say anything one way or the other about the credentials, but he also hasn't signed anything for Sterling's legal team. Yet. There's pressure. Whether he folds, I don't know. Mason looked at the kitchen table covered in his notes, the water stain on the ceiling, the coffee mug he'd refilled 3 times and not finished once. Okay, he said. I'm filing tonight. He spent 2 hours on the formal safety report, which was not a quick form. It required specific technical language, referenced regulation numbers, and demanded the kind of precision that Mason usually found straightforward, but that felt, under these circumstances, like assembling evidence in a courtroom while someone watched over his shoulder. He was meticulous. He referenced the photographs he'd taken of the diagnostic screens. He described the tool marks and the access panel discrepancies in terms specific enough to be verifiable. He described the telemetry anomalies in technical language that left no room for casual dismissal. He submitted it at 12:47 in the morning and sat in the kitchen afterward feeling something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite dread but lived somewhere between the two. He went to check on Callie. He always did. Last thing, even though she'd been telling him for 2 years that she was too old for check-ins. And he always said, "I know, I'm just getting water," and she always pretended to believe him. She was asleep, which was the correct condition for a 16-year-old at 1 in the morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then went back to the kitchen and sat down and thought about the aircraft, and the fuel system, and a pilot somewhere with no warning before the gauges went wrong. He was still sitting there when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. The credential wasn't expired. It was suspended 2 days before you used it. Someone suspended it and then let you walk in. Think about why. He stared at the message for a long time. He tried calling the number back. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail, a generic automated message with no name attached. He sent a text asking who this was. No response came that night. He didn't sleep after that. By Friday morning, the shape of the thing had shifted again. The second Sterling Aerospace legal letter had apparently been shared with a journalist, selectively, specifically, in a way that made clear it hadn't been leaked by accident. The new article was brief but effective. Mechanic faces credential fraud allegations in Sterling jet incident. The word fraud had not appeared in the actual legal letter, but it appeared in the headline, and most people don't read far enough past headlines to notice the difference. Dee forwarded it to him at 7 a.m. with a one-word message. Bad. He was at the shop by 7:30, and the shop felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate. The physical space hadn't changed. Torres was there. The other mechanic, a quiet, precise woman named Arlene, who'd been with Mason for 2 years, and who was, in his assessment, better than him at composite work, was prepping tools for a scheduled inspection. But there was something in the air, the particular ambient tension that settles into a small workplace when everyone knows something is wrong and nobody is sure whether to acknowledge it. Mason called a brief morning meeting, which was not something he did. He stood in the middle of the repair bay with Torres and Arlene and Dee and said what he'd decided he needed to say. "I want to be straight with you about where things stand," he said. "I found a problem on an aircraft and I reported it, and the company whose aircraft it is would prefer that I hadn't. They're going to continue making that difficult for me. For a while, that might make it difficult for this shop, which means it might make things difficult for you." He looked at each of them. "I'm not going to ask anyone to stick around if they feel like the situation isn't one they signed up for. I would understand that." Torres looked at Arlene. Arlene looked at Dee. Dee said, "Are you done?" "Yeah." "Good. I've rescheduled the Rodriguez appointment to next month, and I told them we'd waive the service fee as a goodwill gesture. Torres, the Cessna heads are ready to go. Arlene, the inspection docs are on the secondary bench." She looked at Mason. "We have work to do." He stood there for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Stop it," Dee said. "Go fix something." He was in the back of the shop at 10 in the morning when a woman he'd never met walked through the front door. He heard the bell above the door and came through to the front office and found her standing in the middle of the room with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the framed maintenance certifications on the wall. She was in her mid-40s, slightly built, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular bearing of someone who navigated institutions for a living. She wore no company badge. She had a notepad in one hand and a business card ready in the other. Her name, the card said, was Janet Cho. Her title was Senior Aviation Safety Investigator, FAA Office of Audit and Compliance. "I received your report," she said before he could speak. Not hostile, not warm, precise. "That was fast," Mason said. "We prioritize reports that allege active airworthiness risks on in-service aircraft," she said. "I need to ask you some questions, and I want to be clear up front." She lowered her reading glasses from her forehead to her eyes and looked at him over them. "I'm not here to validate your account or challenge it. I'm here to understand what you observed." "Okay," Mason said. "Is there somewhere we can sit?" He led her to the small office off the front room, the one with the metal desk and the rolling chair that squeaked and the filing cabinet he'd been meaning to replace. She sat across from him and opened her notepad, and they spent 90 minutes going through everything, methodically, in the order it had happened. She asked precise technical questions. She asked him to clarify terminology. She asked him twice to slow down and repeat specific details. She did not tell him whether she believed him. She wrote down everything. At the end, she closed the notepad and looked at him directly for the first time without the intermediary of a written question. "The credential situation," she said, "the one Sterling's legal team has raised. I used the technician's credentials with his knowledge and presence," Mason said. "He was standing next to me. I understand that's your account." She tapped the notepad. "I'm going to tell you something that isn't in my brief to tell you, and I'm telling you because it's relevant to your safety and you should know it." She paused in the careful way of someone selecting words with care rather than stalling. "The credentials you used were flagged in Sterling's internal system 48 hours before the incident, not suspended through normal channels, flagged with a specific notation that classified them as available for external contractor use." She watched him process that. "That flag was added by an account with senior administrative privileges." Mason sat with that for a moment. "Someone set it up," he said. "I'm not characterizing it," Janet Cho said. "I'm telling you what the access log shows." She stood and gathered her notepad. "Your safety report is under formal review. I expect to be in contact with you again." She paused at the office door. "In the meantime, Mr. Ryder, be careful about what you say publicly, and be more careful about who you say it to." She left. The bell above the front door rang once. Mason sat in the squeaking chair in the small office for a while, looking at the framed copy of his airframe and power plant certificate on the wall. He'd hung it there when he opened the shop, and he'd never really looked at it since. It had just become part of the wall, like the filing cabinet and the bad overhead light. He looked at it now. Someone had suspended the credential and then made it accessible. Someone had set up the access that was now being used against him, which meant that his walking into that hangar, his decision to stop the truck at Bay 7 out of some mechanic's curiosity, had been seen as a possibility, maybe an opportunity, maybe a plan. He'd been right about the aircraft. He was more certain of that than ever. He was less certain about what he'd walked into. He was still sitting there when Dee appeared in the doorway. "Torres needs you on the Cessna, and you've got a call on the landline. Woman won't leave a name. I almost told her to use your cell, but something about her was..." Dee paused, which was unusual for her. "Just take the call." He picked up the landline on the desk. "Ryder Aviation." A brief silence. Then a voice he recognized, though he hadn't expected to hear it on his shop phone. "Mr. Ryder?" Victoria Sterling. Steady, controlled, but something underneath it that he couldn't name yet. "I owe you an apology. Several of them, but that's not why I'm calling." A pause. "I've been given information today that I should have had yesterday. I need to show it to you." Another pause, shorter. "I need your help." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I would understand," she said in the tone of someone who doesn't often say that and means it now, "if you told me to go to hell." "I'm not going to do that," Mason said. Outside the office window, Torres was waiting by the Cessna, looking toward the office with the patient expression of someone who knows better than to rush the boss. The afternoon sun was cutting through the shop windows at the angle that made the dust in the air visible. All those small particles floating in the light, suspended, waiting to land somewhere. "Tell me where you are," Mason said. She told him to meet her at the Radisson near the airport's north perimeter. Not the Sterling corporate offices, not the private hangar, and not anywhere that had a camera pointed at the front door that her own security team controlled. That detail told Mason something before he'd even gotten in the truck. He told Dee he'd be back in 2 hours. Dee said, "Take your phone." He said he always took his phone. She said, "I know. Take it anyway." The drive took 20 minutes through the kind of mid-afternoon airport traffic that exists in its own particular purgatory. A permanent crawl of rental car shuttles and fuel trucks and taxis going somewhere with urgency but no speed. Mason used the time to think about what Victoria Sterling's voice had sounded like on the phone. He'd been in enough high-pressure conversations to know the difference between someone performing distress and someone actually inside it. The steadiness in her voice had been the deliberate kind, the kind that cost something to maintain. She was in a corner booth in the hotel restaurant, which was the kind of place that served club sandwiches until 10 at night, and kept the lighting low enough that business conversations could happen without feeling observed. She was alone, which he hadn't expected. No assistant, no legal counsel, no Gerald Foss. She had a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched, and a leather portfolio that she had. and a look on her face that was the furthest possible thing from the woman who'd thrown a $50 bill at his feet 3 days ago. She stood when he came in, which also surprised him. "Thank you for coming," she said. He sat down across from her. A server appeared and he ordered coffee without looking at the menu, and the server disappeared. Victoria Sterling sat back down and looked at him with the direct, assessing quality that he was starting to understand was not performance. It was just how she processed things. "Before I show you what I have," she said, "I want to say something." "Okay." "I was wrong about you." She said it simply, without theatrical weight behind it. "Not just about the aircraft, about the way I spoke to you. The money." She paused. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days, which is longer than I usually spend thinking about my own behavior, and I'm aware that's not a particularly flattering thing to admit." She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it down. "What I did was arrogant, and it was unkind, and I'm sorry." Mason looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. She blinked. "That's it? What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Most people would—" She stopped. "Never mind. You're right." She opened the portfolio. "Let me show you what I found." What she laid on the table between them was a set of printed documents, internal maintenance authorization logs, formatted in the specific way of Sterling Aerospace's proprietary fleet management system. They covered the past 14 months of service activity on the G800. She slid them across to him. "I had our IT security director pull these this morning," she said. "Not Gerald's team, my personal IT director who reports directly to me. I asked her to pull the raw authorization logs, every access, every modification, every timestamp." She watched him scan the first page. "I want you to tell me what you see." Mason read carefully. He read the way he read technical documents, without skimming, without jumping to conclusions, following the data through the sequence it presented rather than the sequence he expected. After 4 minutes, he set the first page aside and went to the second. After another 3 minutes, he looked up. "This record," he said, pointing to an entry dated 11 weeks prior. "Engine fuel controller inspection, signed off by the lead maintenance supervisor. David Carr. He's been with us 6 years. This says the inspection was completed and the unit was certified airworthy." Mason moved his finger to a line in the authorization chain above the sign-off. "But the authorization code here, this isn't a standard maintenance approval code. This is an administrative override." Victoria was very still. "An administrative override means someone with senior system access approved this sign-off above the technical level," Mason said. "It bypasses the normal dual certification requirement. You'd need that if, say, the work being signed off on wasn't actually work that had been performed." He looked at her. "Or if the work that had been performed wasn't what the record said." "Who has administrative override access?" she asked, though from her expression he thought she already knew. "In your system, based on what I saw in the hangar logs and what Marcus Webb told me about your FAA filing structure." He paused. 3 people, probably. You, your IT director, and your COO. She exhaled slowly through her nose. She didn't say Garrett Wills's name. She didn't need to. "How long has he been doing this?" Mason asked. "I don't know the full scope yet," she said. "My IT director is still pulling logs, but the pattern starts approximately 10 months ago." She folded her hands on the table with the precision of someone who needs something physical to do with their hands. "Which is about 2 months after we entered into preliminary discussions with Hendrix Dynamics." Mason sat with that. 10 months. Which meant this hadn't been a reactive decision, someone panicking and making a bad choice. This had been a plan, assembled over time with the specific timeline of a corporate acquisition as its scaffolding. "Walk me through what you think this is," he said, not challenging her, asking because she had access to the internal context he didn't have, and because understanding her version was part of understanding the whole shape. Victoria looked at the table for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled, but the effort was more visible now. "Garrett Wills has been with Sterling for 11 years. He built most of our operational infrastructure. He has relationships with every major vendor, every regulatory contact, every key hire." She paused. "He also has a significant equity stake in the company, tied to a performance agreement that predates the Hendrix discussions. Under the terms of that agreement, A major acquisition triggers a mandatory equity restructuring that would substantially dilute his position. So the acquisition costs him money, Mason said, approximately $40 million in projected value, depending on the deal structure. She let that number sit there. He never objected to the acquisition. He was supportive, visibly in board meetings, in correspondence. He managed the due diligence process. She paused. He managed it completely. He was the one running the documentation review. Yes, Mason thought about that. A man running a due diligence process that was also the thing he needed to destroy. Setting up the infrastructure of his own interference from inside the machinery he controlled. The maintenance records he altered, Mason said. Were they in the due diligence package? Yes. Aircraft fleet maintenance history is standard documentation in an aerospace acquisition. Hendrix's legal team reviewed them as part of their operational assessment. She paused. Clean records supported the deal. Flawed records would raise questions, could delay the deal, or create liability concerns serious enough to give Hendrix grounds to walk. Yes, but that's the documentation side. She looked at him directly. The aircraft itself is the other side, Mason said quietly. If the aircraft fails in flight, if there's an incident during the acquisition period, especially one that involves a fuel system failure on a flagship aircraft, the liability exposure alone could kill the deal regardless of what the records say. The restaurant hummed around them with its ambient noise, the distant sound of a television, the clink of someone's silverware 3 booths away, the low conversation of 2 men at the bar who weren't listening to them. Victoria picked up her coffee and finally drank some of it. Her hand was steady. He noticed that she kept it steady deliberately. He needed the aircraft to fly, Mason said, following it through. The visible problem, the FADEC fault, that grounded the plane and brought in the engineering team and eventually me. That wasn't his plan. That was a separate mechanical issue that happened to ground the aircraft before the hidden modification could do its work. That's what I think, Victoria said. A genuine malfunction at the wrong time, from his perspective. The aircraft was supposed to be cleared and flying again within 24 hours of the FADEC issue appearing. It wasn't supposed to be in a hangar for 2 days with 12 engineers picking it apart. And then I showed up. And then you showed up. Something moved across her face. Not quite irony, not quite regret. Something that didn't have a clean name. I thought Gerald Voss, I thought he was protecting the company when he pushed back on what you said. Gerald is... She stopped. Gerald does what Garrett tells him. I didn't know that then. I do now. Is Voss part of this? I don't know, she said honestly. He may be a tool rather than a participant. Garrett is very good at using people who don't know they're being used. Mason absorbed that. You need to go to the board, he said, tonight if possible. Not legal, not operations. Straight to the board. And you need to ground all Sterling aircraft until the FAA review is complete. I've already called a board session for tomorrow morning. She paused. Garrett doesn't know about it. As of 2 hours ago, he thinks I'm in Dallas for meetings. Where is he? In the office, running his normal day. Something flickered in her expression. He sent me a message this morning expressing concern about the Ryder situation and recommending we accelerate the legal response. She looked at Mason steadily. He recommended we pursue credential fraud charges formally and issue a public statement about unauthorized system access. Of course he did, Mason said. If I'm the story, the aircraft isn't. They sat in silence for a moment. The anonymous text I received, Mason said. 2 nights ago. Someone told me the credential had been suspended and then reflagged for external access. Do you know who sent it? Victoria's expression shifted slightly. A compression around the eyes that might have been uncertainty or might have been recognition. My IT director, she said. She found the flag Wednesday afternoon when she started pulling logs. She didn't feel safe coming forward through official channels yet, but she wanted you to know. A pause. She's the one who came to me this morning with everything she'd found. Her name? Sandra Okafor. She's been with me 3 years. Victoria paused. She's good. And she's scared, which tells me she understands the scope of this. Mason thought about scope. He thought about a COO, with 11 years of institutional access, administrative override credentials in multiple systems, regulatory filing access, and 40 million reasons to burn a deal down before it closed. He thought about a fuel management system that had been quietly modified to suppress warning indicators, and a pilot who would have had no alert before the failure event, and an aircraft flying over whatever was below it when the system failed. "How many people fly on that aircraft regularly?" he asked. "The regular crew is 2 pilots. For executive flights, board meetings, client presentations, usually 6 to 8 passengers." She paused. The planned flight for the Hendricks closing meeting was scheduled for next Thursday. Full executive team, 10 people, including the pilots. 10 people. Mason looked at his coffee. "You understand that whatever's happening with the acquisition, whatever the financial implications, none of that is the main issue." "I know," she said, and then quieter. "I know. The aircraft cannot fly until it's been fully inspected by independent engineers with no connection to your maintenance chain. I've already issued a grounding order as of this afternoon." She met his eyes. "I should have done it Monday, when you told me to." He didn't say anything to that. "You were right," she said, "and I had you escorted out of the hangar." She said it the way people say things they've been sitting with for days, the words worn smooth from turning them over. "Why did you file the safety report anyway? You could have—" She paused. "You had legitimate grounds to be angry. You could have let it go." He considered how to answer that. He thought about the pilot with no warning before the gauges went wrong. He thought about 10 people on an aircraft over the Gulf of Mexico. "Because those aren't the kinds of things you let go," he said. It was the simplest version of the truth and also the most accurate. She nodded slowly. She looked at the documents on the table between them. "I need your help," she said again, "not just to understand what was done to the aircraft. I need someone who can work with the FAA investigator and with independent engineers, and who can explain what was found and what it means in terms that will hold up under scrutiny." She paused. "Someone who has no institutional connection to Sterling, who has every reason to have walked away, and who didn't." "I'm still the parts delivery guy with the credential problem," Mason said. "Legally, I'm still on the wrong side of Sterling's public narrative. I'm going to fix that." "How?" "Publicly," she said. "I'll issue a statement tomorrow after the board meeting, full retraction of the legal communications. Acknowledgement that your conduct in the hangar was appropriate." She paused. "And the $5 million? We'll formalize the agreement properly." "I'll need my lawyer to review any agreement before I sign anything," Mason said. "And I need it written so that it doesn't restrict my ability to testify or cooperate with the FAA investigation." "Of course." "I'm not doing this for the money," he said. Not as a rebuke, as information she needed to have. "I know," she said, and this time the simplicity of it felt like she actually did. He drove back to the shop with the sun going down behind the highway overpasses and the radio off, turning the conversation over in his mind and looking for the parts of it that didn't fit, because that was the discipline he'd been taught and had spent 17 years maintaining. Never accept a picture as complete just because it looks whole. Look for what's missing. Look for what's been placed too conveniently. Victoria Sterling's account of Garrett Wills was coherent. It fit the evidence. It explained the timeline and the method and the motive with the satisfying interlocking quality of things that are probably true. But Mason had learned enough about institutional environments to know that the person who controls the narrative of an investigation controls what the investigation finds. And Victoria Sterling was, whatever else she was, still the CEO of the company at the center of all of this. He wasn't dismissing her. He was just keeping the question open. He was at the shop until 9 that night, working alongside Torres on the Cessna because the work needed doing and because physical work helped him think, and because Dee had rescheduled 3 appointments for next week that he was going to need to be fully present for. At 8:30, Marcus Webb called. "The FAA records," Marcus said. "Sandra Okafor sent additional documentation to Janet Cho's office this afternoon. The original filed versions versus the modified versions, she was able to pull both from the archival system." A pause. "Janet Cho is moving this up. She's requested access to the aircraft for an independent inspection starting Monday morning." Victoria already grounded it. I know, Janet told me. A pause. There's something else. I got a call this afternoon from an attorney I know. She represents a former Sterling Aerospace employee who was terminated 8 months ago, maintenance supervisor. His name is David Carr. Mason looked up from the engine he was working on. The guy who signed off on the fuel controller inspection. The same. He was terminated 7 months ago, officially for performance issues. He's been trying to dispute the termination for months, but without documentation of what actually happened, there wasn't much to work with. Marcus paused. His attorney reached out because of the news coverage about you. David Carr says he was terminated because he refused to sign off on a maintenance authorization that he believed was improper. He signed it anyway, under pressure, he says, and then was fired a month later, probably because he was a liability. Mason set down the tool he was holding. He knows what was done. He knows part of it. He says he was given specific instructions by someone above him in the authorization chain to certify work he hadn't performed on a component he wasn't given access to inspect. Marcus's voice was careful, deliberate. He didn't know what the modification was. He just knew the authorization was wrong. Who gave him the instructions? He says it came through Gerald Foss, but the override code in the system, the administrative authorization, that's above Foss's access level. Wills, Mason said. That's the inference, yes, but Carr's testimony connects Foss to the instruction chain, and the access logs connect the override to Wills. A pause. Mason, this is going to the FBI. Janet Cho has already flagged it for referral to the Federal Aviation Crimes Unit. Altering FAA regulatory filings is a federal offense. Torres had stopped working and was pretending not to listen, which was the polite thing to do. So Mason walked to the back of the shop and stood near the part shelves where the sound of the overhead fans covered the conversation. What about the public narrative? Mason said. The credential issue, the fraud allegations. That's going to shift when Sterling issues her statement tomorrow, Marcus said. But between now and then, be careful tonight. Wills doesn't know what Victoria has found yet, but he will know the board session was called, and when he starts calculating what that means, he's going to be looking for ways to manage the situation. A brief pause. He already tried to manage you once, Mason, by setting you up as the fall guy. If that falls apart, he's going to need a new approach. Mason stood among the part shelves, like the organized rows of components, the labeled bins, the specific ordered logic of a place where things had their correct positions, and thought about what Marcus was describing. A man who had spent 10 months constructing a structure of falsified records and hidden modifications and framed credentials and manufactured narratives, watching that structure begin to crack. Okay, Mason said. I'll be careful. How's Callie? Marcus said, in the abrupt subject change way he had, which Mason had learned to recognize as his version of expressing concern without wanting to express concern. She's fine. She's at home. Keep her there this weekend if you can. He almost asked why. Then he decided he didn't need to ask why. Yeah, he said, I will. He locked up the shop at 9:15 and drove home through the dark residential streets with his mirrors checked more than usual, which was probably excessive and probably not. Callie was in the kitchen when he got home, working on something for school with headphones on and 3 different browser tabs open and a bowl of noodles going cold beside her laptop. She pulled one ear cup off when he came in. You look better than last night, she said. Slightly. Did something happen? Some things are starting to move in the right direction, he said. Slowly. She studied him. But not over. No, not over. Okay. She put the ear cup back. He made a sandwich he didn't entirely want, stood at the counter eating it, and thought about Garrett Wills sitting in the Sterling Aerospace offices running his normal day. Thought about a man who had decided that $40 million was sufficient reason to put 10 people on a compromised aircraft and point them at the sky. That part of it, the arithmetic of it, the cold sufficiency of the number, was the part Mason kept returning to and couldn't fully absorb. He'd met people in the Air Force who were capable of making that calculation. Usually they had found a way to distance themselves from the physical reality of what the numbers represented. They didn't think about pilots. They didn't think about passengers. They thought about the number and what it meant to them, and they let the abstraction do the work that their conscience couldn't. He'd never respected it. He'd also learned not to be surprised by it. Saturday passed in the specific way of a day you're wading through rather than living in. He got Callie to her soccer practice and fixed a leaking valve on a customer's plane that had been waiting since Wednesday, and ate dinner at the kitchen table with Callie, who told him about a teacher she found unreasonable and a friend situation that was complicated in ways he didn't fully follow but tried to, and he was genuinely glad to sit there and think about something small and domestic for an hour. After she went upstairs, he got a text from Patricia Eng. Board meeting confirmed for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Victoria's legal team has been in touch. They want to coordinate on the formal retraction. We're in a good position. Don't say anything public until I tell you it's clear. He sent back, understood. Then, 20 minutes later, a call from a number he didn't recognize. A different number from the anonymous text, but the same quality of unexpected. He answered. Mr. Ryder. A man's voice. Measured, professionally warm, the kind of voice that had been used for a long time in rooms where the temperature of speech mattered. My name is Garrett Wills. I think it's time we talked. Mason sat very still. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the dark. I'm listening, Mason said. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about what happened with our aircraft, Wills said, and I think it's in both our interests to discuss it before things proceed any further in a direction that could be unnecessarily damaging to Sterling, to the people involved, and frankly, to you. A brief pause. You've been put in an unfair position, Mr. Ryder. You came in good faith, you did good work, and then you got caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with you. I'd like to make that right. His voice was reasonable. It was the most reasonable voice Mason had heard in a week, which was the thing that made it exactly as dangerous as it was. What did you have in mind? Mason said. A conversation, Wills said. In person. Tonight, if possible. Another pause. Perfectly timed. I think when you hear what I have to say, you'll understand that the situation isn't what it appears, and there's a path forward here that protects everyone, including you and your business. Mason looked at the kitchen wall, at the framed photo on the refrigerator, Callie at about 9, missing a front tooth, standing next to a small plane at an air show, laughing. He'd taken that photo. He remembered the day. Where? Mason said. Wills named a location, an office building in the business district. A service entrance, 9 o'clock. Private, he said. No lawyers, no press. Just a conversation between two people who both wanted to resolve something complicated. I'll think about it, Mason said. Of course, Wills said. I hope you'll decide it's worth your time. The call ended. Mason sat there for a full minute. Then he called Marcus Webb. Then he called Patricia Eng. Then he sent a text to Janet Cho's office number. She'd given it to him at the end of their meeting, with the specific instruction to use it if anything changed materially. The text said, Garrett Wills just called me. He wants to meet tonight. Alone. I'm not going. Her response came back in 4 minutes. Correct. Do not go. Keep the call log. We need to talk first thing tomorrow. He put the phone face down on the kitchen table and listened to the house. The refrigerator's hum. The air conditioner's distant cycling. Upstairs, the faint sound of whatever Callie was watching on her laptop. The call from Wills had the shape of an offer, but it had the weight of something else. The specific gravity of a man who has been outmaneuvering people for 11 years, realizing for the first time that the pieces on the board weren't where he thought they were. A man reaching, carefully but quickly, for whatever lever was still within reach. Mason thought about Phil, the technician with headphones around his neck, and whether he'd signed anything for Sterling's legal team. He thought about David Carr, the fired maintenance supervisor with a story he'd been trying to tell for 7 months. He thought about Sandra Okafor, who'd been scared enough to send an anonymous text but principled enough to send it. He thought about 10 people on an aircraft. Whatever Garrett Wills had decided to offer tonight, it was not because he'd had a change of heart. It was because he'd looked at the board and realized something was moving toward him that he hadn't planned for. And that meant the evidence was closer to landing than Mason had known. He got up, rinsed his glass in the sink, and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dark backyard. Then he went upstairs and checked on Callie, who was awake but didn't acknowledge him, which was the closest thing to acknowledgement available at this stage of her life. He said goodnight to her closed door. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about the morning and the board meeting and Janet Cho and the long, careful work of the past week that had all been pointed at a single question. Not whether he was right, but whether right was enough. He thought it might be. He wasn't certain. But he'd done everything he could do from where he stood, with what he had, and there was a particular kind of rest available in that even when sleep wasn't. The house settled around him. Somewhere outside, far away, an aircraft passed overhead. The low, steady sound of engines at altitude, moving through the dark without trouble, carrying whoever it was, carrying toward wherever they needed to be. He listened to it until he couldn't hear it anymore. The board meeting started at 9, and Mason wasn't there for it, which was correct. It wasn't his meeting to be in. He was in the parking garage 2 blocks from the Sterling Aerospace corporate offices at 8:50, sitting in his truck with a coffee going cold in the cup holder, waiting for Patricia Eng to call him when she had something to report. Patricia was inside. She'd been invited as Mason's legal representative, brought in as part of the formal coordination between Victoria's legal team and Mason's interests, and she'd gone in at 8:45 with her litigation face on. The one that looked pleasant from a distance and was made entirely of calculated attention. Mason sat. He watched the garage's concrete pillars and thought about nothing useful. His phone rang at 9:40. "It's moving," Patricia said without preamble. Victoria presented everything: Okafor's documentation, the access logs, the archive comparison of the FAA filings. The board is shaken. 2 members wanted to halt the meeting and call legal counsel. Victoria overrode them. A brief pause. He could hear her moving, heels on a hard floor. Wills was summoned at 9:15. He walked into the room not knowing what was on the table. How did he react? Controlled initially. He's good. I'll give him that. He questioned the sourcing of the documentation, suggested the IT logs could have been misinterpreted, implied that the situation with you had created a context in which Victoria might be a pause. He used the word compromised, meaning her judgment. Smart, Mason said, because it was. It would have been smarter 4 days ago, Patricia said, before Okafor handed Janet Cho the archived originals of the FAA filings with the version timestamps. Another pause. The board chair, woman named Estelle Park. She's been on the board 9 years. She asked Wills directly whether he had used administrative override credentials to modify maintenance authorization records. A brief silence on the line. He said he'd need to consult with his personal attorney before answering any questions of that nature. Mason looked at the parking garage ceiling. That's a loud answer. That's what Estelle Park said. Those exact words. Patricia's voice carried the particular dry satisfaction of a lawyer watching someone else's case fall apart. The meeting is still going. I'm outside. The board has called an emergency session with outside legal counsel and has asked Wills to surrender his access credentials pending investigation. He hasn't left the building yet, but his assistant cleared his schedule for the rest of the day about 20 minutes ago. What about Foss? Being interviewed separately. He lawyered up faster than Wills, actually, which suggests he knew more than he was letting on and had been thinking about this moment for longer than Wills expected. A pause. Mason, they want you to come in, not to the boardroom. There's a conference room on the 4th floor. Victoria wants to talk to you and Janet Cho together before the FAA's independent team arrives at the aircraft this afternoon. He drove to the building and parked in the visitor section and went through the lobby with his contractor's badge, the same kind of laminated clip-on badge you got at every corporate building, the kind that told security you were allowed to be there, but nobody needed to know your last name. The receptionist called up and then directed him to the 4th floor, and he rode the elevator with a man in a suit who was staring at his phone with the intensity of someone having a bad morning, and neither of them said anything. The conference room was glass-walled on 2 sides, looking out over an open office floor where he could see through the glass the ordinary activity of people who didn't yet know how much their company had changed in the last hour. Janet Cho was already there, seated at the table with a file open in front of her. Victoria Sterling stood near the window with a coffee she wasn't drinking. Patricia came in 2 minutes after Mason. "Thank you for coming," Janet Cho said, in the tone that made clear this was professional courtesy, not sentiment. They sat. What followed was 2 hours of the most detailed technical conversation Mason had participated in since his last military review board, the kind that required total precision and offered no room for approximation. Janet Cho walked through the FAA's preliminary findings from Okafor's documentation. She described what the independent inspection of the aircraft had found in its first 4 hours that morning. She used careful language, regulatory language, the kind that was built for accuracy rather than drama, but the substance of it was unambiguous. The fuel management controller had been physically modified, not just software, hardware. A secondary bypass circuit had been installed inside the controller housing that would, under specific fuel flow conditions that occurred during extended cruise flight, override the warning threshold sensors and suppress the alert cascade. The modification was small, professionally executed, and would have been completely invisible to a standard pre-flight inspection. It would have required access to the controller housing, specialized knowledge of the system architecture, and approximately 40 minutes of unobserved time in the avionics bay. "Who did the physical work?" Mason asked. "We don't know yet," Janet said. "The installation is skilled, not something a manager with administrative credentials could do themselves. Someone with hands-on avionics experience performed the modification. We're looking at access logs for the hangar during the relevant window." "Carr," Mason said. "David Carr. The maintenance supervisor who was terminated. He said he was pressured to authorize work he didn't inspect. Is it possible the authorization covered access time that was used for this?" "That's one of the lines we're investigating," Janet said. She looked at her notes. "We've spoken with Mr. Carr this morning. His account is consistent with what you've just described, and it's consistent with the authorization timestamps in the logs." A brief pause. "He's cooperating fully. He's been trying to cooperate for 7 months. Victoria, from her position near the window, said quietly, "He should have had someone to cooperate with 7 months ago." She wasn't directing it at anyone in the room. She was just saying it. Nobody disputed it. "The federal referral," Patricia said. "What's the timeline?" "The Aviation Crimes Unit has been briefed," Janet said. "Given the nature of the modification, this isn't record falsification alone. This is physical tampering with a flight-critical system. The classification is serious. I expect formal federal involvement within 72 hours. She looked at Mason. "Your formal safety report, your photographic documentation, and your written account are part of the evidentiary record. That's not going to change regardless of what happens with the private legal questions." The private legal questions were still the $50 bill in the room, the thing that had started all of it, the credential issue, the formal allegations that Sterling's legal team had floated into the press. Victoria turned from the window. "I'm issuing a public statement this afternoon," she said. "Full retraction of the legal communications, explicit acknowledgement that Mason's conduct in the hangar was not only appropriate, but that it identified a condition that, if the aircraft had flown, would have put lives at serious risk." She paused. "I'm also making a public apology. Personal, not just corporate." "You don't have to make it public," Mason said. "I know I don't have to." She looked at him steadily. "I want to. What I said to you in that hangar—" She stopped. Then, "People were watching. Some of them filmed it. The way I treated you is out there, and it's been used as part of a story that painted you as someone who deserved it. I want to correct that in the same form it happened." He thought about arguing with her. He decided it wasn't worth arguing about. "Okay," he said. "The $5 million, Patricia said, in the voice she used when she was moving from emotional territory to contractual. "We'll need the agreement drafted in terms that—" "I already told him it would be clean," Victoria said. "No restrictions on testimony, no non-disclosure on the safety issues, no clauses that limit his ability to speak to regulators." She looked at Patricia directly. "Draft it however you need to and send it to my legal team. We'll turn it around same day." Patricia made a note. "I'll have something to you by end of business." They wrapped up at 11:40. Janet Cho gathered her files with the efficient finality of a woman who had 3 other places to be and left. Patricia stayed behind to exchange contact information with Victoria's legal team, which left Mason and Victoria alone in the glass conference room for the first time. He was standing, gathering his jacket from the back of the chair. She was still near the window. "The call from Will's last night," she said. "You didn't go." "No." "What did you think he was going to offer?" Mason considered the question. "Money, probably. Framed as a settlement? Make it look like a mutual resolution rather than a payoff. And maybe something else. Some version of the story in which what he'd done was complicated and understandable and didn't need to become public." "Would any of it have worked?" He looked at her. "No." She nodded slowly. "I've been trying to understand him," she said. "Garrett. I've worked alongside him for 11 years. He's not someone I would have described as capable of this." She paused. "I don't know if that's more disturbing or less." "It usually is someone you wouldn't describe that way," Mason said. "Most of the time." She looked at him for a moment. "You've seen this before." "I've seen people decide that a number is worth more than what it costs," he said. "Yeah." She turned back to the window and looked at the city below. The ordinary movement of it, vehicles and people, and the flat Texas midday light on glass buildings. "I should have listened to you Monday," she said, "before any of this became public, before the legal letters, before—" She stopped. "I should have listened." You didn't know me," he said, not to absolve her, just because it was true. "No, but I made a judgment based on your jacket and your truck and what you looked like when you walked through the door." She said it flatly, without softening it for herself. "And then, when the choice was between believing you and believing the architecture Garrett had been building for 10 months, I went with the architecture. It was convincing architecture. That's not an excuse." She turned to face him. "I'm going to be saying that in public this afternoon, and I want you to hear me say it here first. What I did was wrong. The money was wrong. The tone was wrong. Having you removed was wrong." She paused. "I know an apology doesn't undo the week you've had." "No," he said, "it doesn't. But I'm giving it anyway." He picked up his jacket. "I know," he said. "I heard you." He was almost at the door when she said, "Your daughter, Callie?" He stopped. "You mentioned her, I think. Or someone did. She's what, 16? "Yeah." "Is she interested in aviation?" He thought about it. "She says no, but she asks questions that suggest otherwise." Victoria almost smiled. Not the polished public expression, but something smaller and more genuine. "Tell her to keep asking the questions." He took the elevator back down and walked through the lobby and out into the parking lot and stood in the full noon heat of a Texas May for a moment before getting in his truck. The city went about its business around him. A jet moved across the sky to the south, low on approach to the main terminal, gear dropping into position. He tracked it automatically, the way he always did. The scan, the assessment, the small, unremarkable professional habit of a man who had spent 17 years knowing that aircraft in the air were the result of work done on the ground. He got in the truck and called Dee. "How's it look?" she said before he could speak. "Better," he said. "A lot better. Rodriguez Aviation called again. They want to reschedule. Schedule them for whatever works." "Already did," she said. "I told you it would come back around." "You didn't tell me that." "I thought it very loudly in your direction," Dee said, and hung up. He drove back to the shop and worked the rest of the afternoon with Torres and Arlene, doing the physical, specific work of actual aircraft maintenance, cylinder heads and landing gear, and a faulty altimeter calibration that turned out to be a wiring issue rather than a sensor issue, which was the kind of problem that was satisfying to find because it meant you'd looked past the obvious explanation and found the actual one. He was under a wing at 4 in the afternoon when his phone buzzed with a news alert. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at it. Sterling Aerospace CEO apologizes to mechanic, retracts legal claims in corporate sabotage investigation. He read the first paragraph. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and went back to the wiring. Torres, from the other side of the aircraft, said, "That the Sterling thing?" "Yeah." "You good?" "Yeah," Mason said. "I'm good." The next 72 hours moved with the different tempo of a situation that had shifted from crisis to process. Federal involvement changed the quality of attention around the case. Things moved both faster and more formally, with the kind of institutional momentum that, once established, was difficult to redirect. Two agents from the Federal Aviation Crimes Unit came to Mason's shop on Monday morning and spent 3 hours going through everything he'd documented, asking the kind of questions that were already answered in the documentation, and that were being asked again because the answers needed to come from his mouth into a recording rather than from a written file. He answered everything precisely and completely, the way he'd answered Janet Cho, the way he'd been answering people all week, because the only version of events he had to offer was the one that had actually happened. The independent technical inspection of the G800 was completed Monday evening. The report, which Mason received a summary of through Janet Cho, confirmed everything he'd identified from the diagnostic screens in the hangar, and then some. The fuel management controller modification was documented in full technical detail. 3 additional anomalies were found in the avionics system that suggested a more extensive interference than had initially been apparent. Things that wouldn't have caused an immediate failure, but that, combined with the primary modification, created a cascading vulnerability that a qualified aviation engineer would describe, and later did describe in a federal filing, as a designed catastrophic failure condition. Designed. That was the word in the report. Not accidental, not negligent. Designed. When Mason read that word, he sat with it for a while. He'd known it technically since Friday. But knowing a thing and having it documented in federal technical language were 2 different kinds of knowing, and the second kind had a weight that took some time to settle. David Carr gave a full formal statement on Tuesday. He'd been trying to give it for 7 months, and there was something in the account of him finally being able to give it, reported to Mason secondhand through Marcus Webb, who'd spoken to Carr's attorney, that was the particular exhausted relief of a man who had been carrying something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. Carr described the pressure, the specific conversation with Foss, the authorization he'd been told to sign, the access window he'd been told to approve without documented purpose. He described the way his termination had been structured, the performance improvement plan that appeared from nowhere, the gradual marginalization, the final meeting in which he was told his position was being eliminated due to restructuring. He also described, quietly and with specific detail, the moment he'd understood what the authorization he'd signed had probably been used for. He said he'd tried to report it internally. He said the report had gone nowhere. He said he'd spent 7 months trying to find someone who would listen, and that he was glad someone finally had, even if the path to that point had required a $5 million bet in a private hangar and a man in a worn jacket who hadn't walked away when he should have. That last part was Carr's words, relayed through Marcus, and Mason told Marcus that was unnecessary, and Marcus said, "I'm just reporting what the man said," which was true and also slightly annoying. Gerald Foss's attorney released a statement Tuesday afternoon. It was carefully worded, the kind of legal document that gestures toward cooperation while committing to nothing. But its essential content was that Foss intended to cooperate fully with the investigation and had been acting under directives he had not fully understood the purpose or implications of. Whether that was true or a legal strategy was a question for people who got paid to determine such things. Mason noted it and moved on. Garrett Wills said nothing publicly. His personal attorney issued a brief statement indicating that Wills denied all allegations and intended to mount a vigorous defense. He had surrendered his access credentials, been placed on administrative leave, and was, by all accounts, spending his time in meetings with lawyers rather than doing anything Mason would ever know about directly. The thing about Garrett Wills, the thing Mason kept coming back to when he had time to think about it, was the quality of the planning. 10 months. Systematic, layered, with contingencies built in and multiple paths to the desired outcome. It was sophisticated in a way that demanded a particular acknowledgement, the kind of acknowledgement you give to things that are skillful, regardless of what they're skillful in service of. Wills had looked at a $2 billion acquisition and identified every lever and every vulnerability, and had pulled and pushed at them with the patience of someone who understood that plans of this kind fail not because they're wrong, but because they encounter something unpredictable. The unpredictable thing had been a parts delivery driver with a mechanic's curiosity and 17 years of military aviation in his hands, who had stopped his truck at Bay 7 for no reason he could fully account for. Mason didn't spend too much time on the poetry of that. It was the kind of thing that could tip toward a story about fate if you weren't careful, and he'd never had much use for fate as an explanatory framework. He'd stopped because he'd stopped. The rest was work. On Wednesday afternoon, Patricia Eng sent him the finalized agreement with Sterling Aerospace. He read it twice. He had her walk him through two clauses he wanted to understand more fully. Then he signed it. $5 million, clean, unrestricted, with a separate letter from Victoria Sterling's personal office explicitly confirming that the agreement contained no provisions that could be construed as limiting Mason's cooperation with any regulatory or federal investigation, and that the payment was unconditional acknowledgement of the agreed bet and of Mason's role in identifying the safety risk. He sat at the kitchen table with the signed document on the screen in front of him and thought about the water heater. He thought about Dee, who had stood in the shop doorway and said, "We have work to do," without blinking. He thought about Torres and Arlene, who'd kept working while the whole structure around them was uncertain. He thought about Marcus Webb, who had spent a week of his professional credibility on a man he'd met over bad hotel coffee. He thought about Patricia Eng, who had said, "Don't talk to anyone at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night," and had meant it and been right. He thought about Phil, the technician with the headphones, who had never signed anything for Sterling's legal team and whose non-cooperation had been a small, quiet, uncelebrated act of stubbornness that had kept one more door open at a moment when doors were being closed fast. He thought about Callie. He called her because she was at school and he couldn't tell her in person. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was somewhere she could take a call, which probably meant the cafeteria. "Dad, I'm at lunch." "I know. I'll be quick." He paused. "It's over." A brief silence on the line. Then, "Over, over?" "Over, over." "And the—" She lowered her voice slightly. "The money?" "It's in writing." Another silence. He could hear the cafeteria noise around her, the specific sound of 100 teenagers being collectively loud. "Okay," she said. And then, in a different tone, younger than her usual tone, the one she mostly kept packed away now, "Dad, I'm really glad." "Me too," he said. "Okay, I have to go. My food is getting cold." "Go eat." She hung up. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and thought that he really should deal with that. The formal press conference was Thursday morning, held at Sterling Aerospace's corporate offices. Mason was not required to be there and had considered not going, but Patricia had advised that his presence, visible, composed, not triumphant, was the cleanest possible counter-narrative to the story that had been built against him over the past week. Show up, stand there, don't perform anything. Let the substance speak. He wore a clean shirt. He did not wear a tie. He drew the line at the tie. Victoria spoke first and for the longest. She was precise, and she was public, and she was direct in a way that Mason suspected cost her more than it looked like it cost her, because the public admission of error is always more expensive when the error is specific and named and the person you wronged is standing 10 feet away. She named what she'd done. She named what her company had allowed to happen through insufficient scrutiny of the people running its operations. She named Mason specifically and described his conduct in the hangar with a technical accuracy that told Mason she'd actually done her homework on what he'd done, not just what she'd been told he'd done. She said the words, "I was wrong," 3 times. Each time they sounded the same, not rehearsed, just settled. When it was Mason's turn at the microphone, he kept it brief. He described what he'd observed in technical terms, referenced the FAA investigation as the authoritative account, thanked Marcus Webb by name and Janet Cho by title. He said that the only reason he'd stayed involved when he could have walked away was because the safety issue was real, and because real safety issues don't become less real when they become inconvenient to report. A journalist asked whether he felt vindicated. He thought about the word vindicated for a moment. "I feel like the right thing happened eventually," he said. "That's different from vindicated. Vindicated suggests the doubt was reasonable. I don't think the doubt was reasonable, but I understand why it was there, and I'm glad it's resolved." Another journalist asked about the money. "It was a fair bet," Mason said. "I won it fair." Laughter from the room, which he hadn't intended, and which settled something in the air that had been waiting to settle. After the conference ended, in the corridor outside while people moved around them with the dispersing energy of an event winding down, Victoria Sterling found him. Not formally, she just came up beside him as he was gathering his jacket and said, quietly enough that it was only for him, "How do you do it?" He looked at her. "Do what?" "Stay level," she said. "Through all of this. The accusations, the public narrative, She gestured vaguely at the corridor, the week, everything. "You never looked like you were about to break." He thought about the kitchen table at 1 a.m, the water heater, Callie's face when he'd picked her up from school and she'd shown him the news article, the anonymous text that had kept him awake until 4 a.m, the squeaking chair in the small office and the water stain on the ceiling and the phone calls from clients who'd decided he wasn't worth the risk. "I look like that plenty," he said. "Just not in public." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something? Off the record? Off everything?" "Sure." "When you were in the hangar, when you saw what was in the data," she paused, "when you knew what was at stake and you also knew what it was going to cost you to say it, did you think about not saying it?" He considered that honestly. "For about 2 seconds," he said. "What stopped you?" He thought about the pilot with no warning, 10 people over the Gulf. He thought about what he knew and what knowing obligated. "It wasn't really a choice," he said. "It just looked like one from the outside." She absorbed that. Then she said, "I'm going to try to run this company better. I know that's something people say in these situations, and it usually doesn't mean much. I'm saying it anyway because I mean it, and I wanted you to hear it directly." "Okay," he said. "I'm going to hold myself to being heard on it," she said. "So if in 6 months Sterling is back in the news for something that tells you I didn't mean what I said..." She stopped. "You'd have a right to say so." "I'd probably say so," he said. She almost smiled. "I thought you might." He drove home. He stopped at a hardware store on the way and bought the supplies he needed to fix the ceiling stain, which was a $20 repair that he'd been deferring for 6 months for no reason he could identify, except that some things accumulate inertia simply by being ignored long enough. He fixed it that afternoon. It took 40 minutes. He stood on a step stool in the kitchen and applied joint compound and let it dry and sanded it and applied paint and stepped down and looked at it, and it looked fine. Not perfect, just fine, which was what a repaired ceiling stain was supposed to look like. Callie came home from school while he was cleaning the brush in the sink. She dropped her bag by the door and came into the kitchen and looked at the ceiling. "You finally fixed it," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She opened the refrigerator and stood looking into it with the particular blankness of a teenager who is hungry but can't identify for what. "There's no food." "There's food. There's no good food." "I'll order something," he said. "Pizza?" "Sure." She closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter and looked at him with the reading him expression that she'd inherited from somewhere and that he'd never fully gotten used to. "So what happens now?" she said. "With the shop? With everything?" He thought about it. The $5 million, which was sitting in an account, and which he hadn't fully decided what to do with, beyond the obvious immediate things, the shop's outstanding equipment debt, the building's maintenance backlog, the salary buffer that would let him stop lying awake worrying about the next slow month. The larger things were still taking shape. "The shop keeps running," he said. "We'll probably expand a little. Marcus Webb has been talking about whether there's a model for independent safety inspection services, not tied to any single airline or fleet operator, separate from the repair work." He paused. "I don't know yet. I'm thinking about it." "And the Sterling thing? Is that just done?" "The investigation goes on," he said. "There'll be hearings, probably. Federal process takes a while. I'll cooperate with whatever they need." He paused. "But my part in it, the active part, I think that's done, yeah." She nodded slowly. Then, "You could do anything now, you know. With that much money, you could..." "I know," he said. "But you're going to keep fixing planes." He looked at his daughter. 16 years old, her mother's eyes, her own particular stubbornness, the questions she asked that suggested she was paying more attention to the world than she let on. Yeah, he said. That's what I know how to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone she used when she was about to say something genuine and was covering it with casualness, I think that's right. He ordered the pizza. They ate it at the kitchen table, and she told him about her day. A test she was pretty sure she'd failed, a situation with a friend that was still complicated but maybe less complicated than last week. A teacher who had unexpectedly said something interesting about structural engineering that she wanted to look up later. He listened. He asked questions that were mostly the right questions. He got 2 of them wrong, and she told him so, and he accepted the correction. Outside, the evening was doing what Texas evenings do in late spring, going golden and warm and almost forgiving, the light coming through the kitchen windows at the angle that made the room feel temporary and complete at the same time. He cleaned up after dinner, and Callie went upstairs to study, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet, and he thought about a $50 bill on concrete and what it had cost him and what it had eventually, through work and stubbornness and the help of people who hadn't needed to help him, returned. He didn't feel like a man who had won something. He felt like a man who had done the job, and the job was done, and that was what there was, and it was enough. The weeks after the press conference had a different texture than the weeks before it. Not easier. Exactly. The federal investigation was ongoing, and ongoing federal investigations have a way of reaching back into your life at irregular intervals to ask for one more document, one more clarification, one more hour of your time in a conference room with people who take careful notes and never tell you how it's going. But the quality of the difficulty had changed. Before, Mason had been fighting against something that was actively trying to erase him. After, he was simply participating in a process that would take as long as it took, and that distinction, between being the target and being the witness, made a difference that was hard to articulate but was present in the quality of his sleep, in the way he drove to work in the morning, in the particular absence of the low-grade dread that had been sitting in his chest for 10 days like a stone he'd gotten used to carrying. He went back to work. That's the part that doesn't make it into the dramatic version of events, the going back, the ordinary reassembly of a life that had been interrupted. Torres and Arlene were still there. Dee was still there. The Cessna with the cylinder heads got finished and returned to its owner, who sent a thank you email that was 3 sentences long and entirely sufficient. Rodriguez Aviation rescheduled and came in, and Mason personally did the inspection walkthrough with their maintenance chief, a meticulous man named Garrett, different Garrett, no association, who asked 3 good technical questions and seemed satisfied with the answers. 2 new clients called the week after the press conference, then 4 more the week after that. Mason noticed the pattern without celebrating it, because he'd been in business long enough to know that reputation moved in both directions and that the same visibility that was currently sending clients toward him could, under different circumstances, send them the other way. He kept working. He kept the quality what it was. That was the only sustainable answer he'd ever found. Marcus Webb came by the shop on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after everything ended, uninvited, with 2 cups of coffee from the place across the service road that Mason had always avoided because it was overpriced. But Marcus had never been to the shop before and didn't know the geography of the area's coffee options. He sat in the office with the squeaking chair and the filing cabinet and looked around like a man cataloging things, and Mason let him look because that was just Marcus's way of settling into a space. "I've been talking to some people," Marcus said. "I assume that's why you came." "People in the compliance world, people at the FAA, some independent, people from 2 other airlines and 1 fractional ownership operation." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "There's a gap in how aviation safety oversight works for private and corporate fleets. The commercial side has layers, mandatory audits, union reporting structures, independent check airmen, the whole architecture. The corporate side has regulations, but the enforcement depends heavily on self-reporting and on the quality of the designated airworthiness representatives." He paused. "Which, as we have recently established at some cost, can be compromised." "Yeah," Mason said. "There's appetite for a third-party inspection and certification service specifically for high-value private and corporate aircraft. Independent, not connected to any fleet operator, not connected to any manufacturer. Staffed by people who have no financial relationship with the aircraft owners, except the inspection fee." He looked at Mason. "You'd need to build it from scratch. You'd need the right people, The right certification framework, probably 18 months before you're fully operational at the level you'd want to be. How many people are we talking about? To start, maybe 6, including you. People with your kind of background. Military avionics, hands-on systems experience, no corporate aviation baggage. He paused. I've got 2 names already, Webb, who is me, in a consulting capacity on the compliance framework, and Janet Cho, who is retiring from the FAA in 8 months and who told me, when I raised the idea, that she'd been thinking about something like this for 4 years. Mason looked at his coffee. Janet Cho told you she'd been thinking about this for 4 years. Her words. And she said them to you when? Yesterday, Marcus said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has been making calls. Mason leaned back in the chair, which did not squeak when you leaned back, only when you shifted weight side to side, and he'd learned to live with that. He looked at the framed A&P certificate on the wall. He'd been doing a lot of looking at that certificate lately, which wasn't something he could entirely explain. What would this cost to build, he said. A lot less than $5 million, Marcus said, but enough that it matters who's funding it and why. He looked at Mason steadily. It needs to be independent. That means the capital can't come with strings. It won't, Mason said. They sat with that for a moment. I'm not saying yes yet, Mason said. I know. I'm saying I want to think about it seriously, which is different from the 3 previous times you've suggested expanding operations where I said I'd think about it and then didn't. I know that too, Marcus said. That's why I came in person. After Marcus left, Mason stood in the repair bay for a while, watching Torres work and not really seeing it, turning the idea over in his mind the way you turn a piece of metal to see how the light hits it from different angles. The idea of building something new, something with a specific purpose beyond keeping his existing operation running, had a pull to it that surprised him a little. He'd spent 5 years operating in maintenance mode, keeping the shop alive, keeping the work quality up, keeping the lights on. He'd been so focused on not losing what he had that he hadn't thought much about what it might look like to actually build something. He called Patricia Eng that evening, not about the idea specifically, but about the financial structure. How you organized something like this, what the right entity type was, how you insulated operational independence from funding source. Patricia said she had a colleague who specialized in nonprofit corporate structure and would connect them. She said this without asking what the idea was, because she'd been his lawyer long enough to know that if he was asking about independence and funding sources, the idea was probably something worth doing. He talked to Callie about it that night, over dinner that was leftover pizza reheated in the oven, because neither of them had gotten around to grocery shopping again. You'd basically be like a watchdog, she said, following his explanation with the concentrated attention she gave to things she was actually interested in, which was distinguishable from the polite attention she gave to things she wasn't. Something like that. Independent inspection. No relationship with the operators except the technical work. Like a building inspector. But for planes. More technical than a building inspector. But yeah, that's the general idea. She chewed on a piece of crust and thought about it. And Marcus would help run it? He'd do the regulatory compliance framework. Janet Cho would be the senior inspector, probably, once she's out of the FAA. Janet Cho is the woman from the investigation, yeah. Callie was quiet for a moment. Then, that's actually kind of cool, that all those people ended up in the same place. It's not a place yet, Mason said. It's an idea. I know, but still. She looked at him. You want to do it? He thought about whether to qualify it. Yeah, he said. I think I do. She nodded in the specific way that meant she'd already decided he should, and was acknowledging that he'd caught up. The federal process, moving in its institutional way, began to produce outcomes in the 6th week after the press conference. The Aviation Crimes Unit filed formal charges against Garrett Wills on a Tuesday morning, 3 counts related to falsification of FAA regulatory records, 1 count of conspiracy to commit aircraft sabotage, and a federal charge under the Aviation Security Act that Mason's attorney explained to him was specifically related to the intentional compromise of flight-critical systems. The charging document was 38 pages long, and its technical appendix, which summarized the independent inspection findings, was another 22. Mason read the technical appendix and found it accurate and thorough and recommended 3 clarifications in terminology that Janet Cho's office passed along through the appropriate channels. Gerald Foss was charged separately. Fewer counts, lesser severity, with a cooperation agreement that his attorney had been quietly negotiating since the week after the board meeting. Foss had been, in the end, mostly what Victoria had described, a man who had been used by someone smarter and more ruthless, who had passed instructions down a chain without fully understanding what they'd been issued in service of, and who had then panicked when the structure started falling and chosen the wrong direction to run. That didn't make him innocent. It made him a different category of culpable, and the legal system had a framework for that, which was one of the things legal systems were for. David Carr's wrongful termination case was settled quietly 2 weeks after the charges were filed. Mason didn't know the terms because it was none of his business, but Marcus told him that Carr had been represented by a firm that understood what the timing meant and had negotiated accordingly. Carr had sent Mason a brief handwritten note through Patricia Eng's office, 3 sentences, careful handwriting on plain paper, that said he was grateful and that he hoped things went well for Mason's shop and that he was thinking about getting back into maintenance work when things settled down. Mason kept the note. He put it in the filing cabinet in the small office, in the folder where he kept things that didn't have an obvious category. Phil, the technician with the headphones, had left Sterling Aerospace's employment 2 weeks after the investigation went federal. He hadn't signed anything for their legal team, which had ended up mattering, and his non-cooperation had cost him a job he'd apparently needed, which was the specific kind of price that went unremarked in the larger narrative, but that Mason was aware of, and that bothered him in the quiet way that unpayable debts bother people with a conscience. He didn't have Phil's contact information. He asked Marcus if he could find it, and Marcus said he'd try, and 3 days later Mason had a phone number. He called it on a Wednesday evening. Phil picked up after 2 rings. "Phil, this is Mason Ryder from Hangar 14B. A beat of silence. "Oh, yeah. Hi." The voice of someone trying to recalibrate fast. "I heard you left Sterling." Yeah. A brief pause. "It was kind of a mutual thing." It wasn't a mutual thing, but Mason didn't correct him on that. "I'm expanding my operation," he said. "I'm building out an inspection services division. I need people with hands-on experience and good instincts and no existing entanglements with the corporate fleet world." He paused. "I don't know what your situation is, or whether this is something you'd consider. But if you're looking, I wanted to call." Another silence, longer. "You're serious?" "Yes." "I used the credentials without—" Phil started. "You handed me a tablet and stood next to me," Mason said. "That's what happened. That's what the record shows. That's what I've said every time anyone's asked." A pause. "I know what you didn't sign. I wanted to say thank you for that." Phil was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different, the careful neutrality of someone who'd been braced for something unpleasant and was still adjusting to the fact that it hadn't arrived. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." And then, "I'd be interested in hearing more about the inspection thing." "I'll have someone call you next week," Mason said. "It's still early stage, but the direction is real." He hung up and sat in the kitchen and thought about the specific accounting of a situation, not the legal accounting, not the financial one, but the human one. The people who had been moving through the machinery of this thing, most of them not by choice, and what had happened to them, and what could and couldn't be remedied. He was under no illusion that he could fix all of it. He was also under no illusion that not fixing what was fixable was an acceptable position. The formal agreement between Mason and Sterling Aerospace for the $5 million cleared his bank account on a Friday afternoon in the 7th week. Patricia sent him a confirmation email with the precise tone of professional satisfaction that lawyers use when a thing they've worked for is actually accomplished. And he sat in his truck in the shop parking lot and looked at the number on his phone's banking app for about 30 seconds. Then he called the equipment financing company and paid off the shop's outstanding debt, which had been sitting on his accounts for 3 years and which had never been a crisis but had been a constant background weight of the kind that you forget is there until it's gone. The line item disappearing from his accounts felt like taking off a boot that had been slightly too tight for so long he'd stopped noticing. He set aside a 3-month operating buffer for the shop. He put a portion in accounts for the inspection service startup costs. He talked to a financial advisor that Patricia recommended, a careful, unhurried woman named Helen Yee who asked good questions and didn't try to impress him, about how to structure the rest for stability rather than growth, because stability was what his life actually required and growth for its own sake had never been a goal he understood. And he put some aside for Callie. Not a lot, because she'd have opinions about what a lot meant, and he wanted to have that conversation with her rather than presenting a fact. He told her one evening that there was money set aside and that it was for whatever she decided she needed it for. School, or something she wanted to build, or a situation she couldn't anticipate yet. He told her it didn't come with conditions, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, but I'm not going to spend it on something dumb." And he said he hadn't suggested she would. And she said, "I know, I'm just saying." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The thing about the money, the thing that surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have, was how quickly it stopped feeling like a big number. Not because he spent it carelessly or forgot it was there, but because the presence of security is only conspicuous when you're experiencing its absence. Once the debt was cleared and the buffer was established and the accounts were where they needed to be, the money just became context rather than event. The shop felt the same. The work felt the same. He still drove the same truck, which needed a new alternator that he replaced himself in the shop parking lot on a Saturday morning because that was the kind of thing he did, and the money didn't change that. Callie watched him replace the alternator from the door of the shop, eating an apple with the posture of someone observing a mildly interesting documentary. "You could just get a new truck," she said. "This truck works fine," he said. "It makes a noise." "All trucks make a noise." "Not that noise," she said, and went back inside. Victoria Sterling called him on a Thursday morning in the 8th week, which was unusual enough that he stepped out of the repair bay to take it. She called from her direct line, not through an assistant, and she got to the point quickly enough that he appreciated it. "I want to talk to you about the inspection service," she said. "Marcus Webb mentioned it when I spoke to him last week." "Marcus mentioned it to you?" "He mentioned it to several people, I think. He's been thorough." A pause. "I want to fund a portion of it." Mason stood outside the shop in the morning heat and looked at the service road. "No," he said. A brief silence. "I expected you to say that. The whole value of what we're building is that it's independent. Sterling as a funding source isn't independent." "I'm not proposing a Sterling aerospace investment," she said. "I'm proposing a personal contribution from me, as an individual, to a nonprofit safety organization. No board seat, no advisory role, no conditions on operations, staffing, or findings." A pause. "The contribution would be structured through a blind trust. Legally, your organization would never need to disclose where the funding came from. You'd know because I'm telling you, but it would be clean from a governance standpoint." He thought about it. He thought about Marcus's voice when he'd said it needs to be independent, and that means the capital can't come with strings. He thought about what strings were and whether the kind Victoria was describing were the kind that mattered. "I'll talk to Marcus," he said, "and to our legal people." "That's all I'm asking," she said. He talked to Marcus that evening. Marcus was quiet for a longer time than usual, which meant he was actually thinking rather than reaching for a prepared position. "The blind trust structure is real," Marcus said finally. "I've seen it work. The governance question depends entirely on whether you trust her to leave it alone once the money is in." "Do you think she will?" "I think she means to," Marcus said. "Whether she has the discipline to do it when something happens that she has an opinion about, that's a different question." A pause. "But Mason, that's true of every funder. That's not a Victoria Sterling problem, that's a funding problem. You build the governance so the structure protects you regardless of intent." "Patricia's colleague can do that?" "If she can't, I know someone who can." He told Victoria yes, with the condition that the legal structure be reviewed by their independent counsel before anything was signed, and that if the counsel found anything in the arrangement that created even the appearance of operational influence, the conversation was over. She agreed without negotiation, which told him she'd already thought it through and was reasonably certain it would clear review. It did. The last formal obligation Mason had in the Wills case was a deposition taken on a Wednesday morning in week 10 in a law office downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and strong coffee and the specific institutional seriousness of rooms where people say things that get written down. He sat across a long table from 2 federal attorneys and 2 defense attorneys and a court reporter and answered questions for 4 hours and 15 minutes. He was precise and he was patient, and he didn't editorialize, which was sometimes difficult because the defense attorneys asked questions that were structured to create ambiguity where he had certainty, and the instinct to push back and clarify was strong. He let the precision of the answers do the work instead. Patricia sat beside him and said almost nothing because there was almost nothing that needed saying. Afterward, in the elevator going down, she said, "That's the last of it, I think. The trial is still your deposition testimony. That's the last thing they'll need from you directly." She looked at the elevator doors. "The trial will happen without much involvement from you. They have everything they need." He stood in the lobby after she left and thought about the phrase, "the last of it." He thought about what it meant for something to be finished, not resolved, because resolution was a different thing and sometimes didn't come, but finished in the sense that you'd done what you could do and the rest was out of your hands. He'd lived with the active weight of this thing for 10 weeks, and now it was going to continue in rooms he wasn't in, between people with legal authority he didn't have, grinding toward a conclusion that the evidence was going to determine rather than any further action of his. He walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk, and the city went around him in its ordinary way. Traffic and heat and the distant sound of construction somewhere to the east, a woman walking a dog that was too big for the sidewalk, a food truck at the corner doing a steady lunch business. He was done. The work he'd had to do was done. He got in the truck and drove back to the shop and finished the afternoon's work, which was a turboprop inspection that he'd been delaying for 2 days and that he wanted to complete before the end of the week. He was methodical and careful and found one thing that needed attention and attended to it and documented it properly and cleared the aircraft with the specific quiet satisfaction of work done right. That was the thing nobody talked about, the satisfaction of the ordinary good work, the job completed without incident, the aircraft that flew because someone had paid attention. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't have a story, but it was the whole reason for everything else, and he never stopped knowing that. 3 months after the morning in Hangar 14B, Mason Ryder was standing on the tarmac outside his shop on a Saturday with Callie beside him, and they were watching a Gulfstream G800 lift off the main runway at the far end of the field. It was the same aircraft. He knew it by the registration number, which he'd looked up out of habit, and by the cream exterior with the gold stripe along the fuselage, which caught the afternoon light in a particular way. It had cleared the independent inspection that Janet Cho's team had overseen, completed 4 weeks ago, a full technical review that had taken 8 days and had found the aircraft airworthy, modified fuel management controller replaced, all systems verified, all documentation clean, and accounted for, and cross-referenced against the FAA records that Sandra Okafor had been rebuilding since the investigation began. The aircraft climbed at a steady rate and banked slightly south over the highway, gear retracting into the fuselage with the specific smooth mechanical certainty of systems working as designed. Mason watched it until it was small against the Texas sky, and then until it was a point, and then until it was gone. Callie, beside him, said, "That's it, right? That one?" "Yeah," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She had her arms crossed and her face angled up at the sky where the aircraft had been. She was wearing her soccer cleats, which meant she had practice in an hour, which meant he needed to drive her across town in 40 minutes. The ordinary calculus of a Saturday. "Does it feel weird," she said, "watching it fly?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "It's supposed to fly. That's what it's for." She looked at him sidelong. "You fixed it." "I found what was wrong with it. Other people fixed it." "You know what I mean." He did. He watched the empty sky where the aircraft had been. The afternoon was the particular kind of clear that happened in Texas after a storm had moved through, when the air had been washed and the light came down without interference, and everything looked slightly more itself than usual. The runway markings, the windsock at the end of the field, The distant line of hangars, the sky above all of it, open and blue and indifferent in the way that only sky can be, without malice or favor, just there. He thought about a man he'd been 10 weeks ago, sitting in a truck at Bay 7, turning left instead of right on the service road for no reason he could identify, looking at an aircraft through an open hangar door. He thought about what it cost to say something true when saying it was expensive, and what it cost to not say it, and how those two costs were not symmetrical even when they felt like they might be. He thought about the specific way that doing the right thing and doing the easy thing diverge at the exact moment when it matters most, and how that divergence is where character gets made or doesn't get made, and how you can't prepare for it in advance, not really. You can only be the kind of person who, when the moment comes, chooses without hesitation. He hadn't been without hesitation. He'd hesitated for about 2 seconds. He told Victoria Sterling that, and it was true. But 2 seconds is what you're allowed. 2 seconds to feel the weight of it and then act anyway. He figured most people got about that much, and the ones who took longer usually found reasons to keep hesitating. "Dad," Callie said, "I need to be at practice in 50 minutes. 40, he said. "Same thing." "It's not the same thing." He turned away from the runway. "Come on." They walked back toward the shop, and she was already on her phone, texting someone about something that had nothing to do with aircraft or sabotage or federal investigations or $5 million bets. And that was correct. That was exactly how it should be. She was 16. The things that occupied his life were not supposed to be the whole of hers. He'd learned that from his own father, imperfectly, and was relearning it from Callie, who would not let him forget it. Dee was locking up the front office when they got back. She saw Callie and said, "Cleats." And Callie looked at her feet and then at the shop floor and said, "Sorry, Dee," and took them off and carried them by the laces the rest of the way to the truck. Dee watched this with the satisfaction of a person who has achieved a small but non-trivial victory. "Good week?" Dee said to Mason. "Yeah." Rodriguez came in and left happy. Torres got the annual on the Piper done by noon. Arlene found a stress crack in the Cessna's wing spar that the last shop missed. She paused, with the specific weight of the last item. A stress crack in a wing spar was the kind of thing that the last shop missing was not a minor failure. It was the kind of thing that, had it progressed, would have ended badly over someone's house or someone's field. She caught it at 60% propagation. "Good," Mason said. "Write it up thoroughly. I want a full report in the client's hands by Monday." "Already drafting it," Dee said, and went back inside. He drove Callie to soccer practice and sat in the parking lot for a while watching the team warm up. 32 teenagers running patterns on green turf in the late afternoon light, coaches with clipboards, parents on the sideline doing the particular half-attentive, half-distracted thing that parents did, half watching the field and half on their phones and wholly committed to being there, even if they couldn't have explained why being there mattered as much as it did. He watched Callie find her position in the warm-up drill and settle into the specific, focused version of herself that she became on the field. Less ironic, less managed, more present than she usually let herself be around him. She was good. He knew she was good because he'd watched every game for 6 years, but he also knew it in the objective way you knew things when you'd seen enough examples of a skill to understand its range. She was fast in the specific way that came from reading the field rather than reacting to it, which was the kind of speed that didn't show up in tryout drills but showed up in actual games. And it was the kind of thing that was going to continue developing because she was 16 and hadn't hit the ceiling of it yet. He thought about what Victoria Sterling had said. Tell her to keep asking the questions. He thought about what those questions might lead to and how much of that trajectory was already in motion and how little of it was his to control and how that was the specific terror and relief of raising a person. The moment you realize they're becoming something beyond what you've taught them. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Webb. Janet Cho confirmed. She's in, effective her retirement date, 8 months from now. You need to start thinking about office space. He replied, I know someone with a shop. Marcus's reply came back in 20 seconds. That's not what I meant, and you know it. He did know it. The inspection service was going to need its own physical presence. Separate from the repair shop, identifiable as a distinct operation with its own identity and its own accountability. He'd been avoiding thinking about that specific step because it made the thing more real than thinking about it in the abstract. And there was something slightly frightening about real in the way there was never anything frightening about abstract. He thought about Phil, who had agreed to come in for a conversation and had arrived on Tuesday with the slightly over-prepared energy of someone who was trying not to seem nervous and was not entirely succeeding. The conversation had gone well. Phil had good instincts and had been in corporate aviation long enough to understand the specific ways it could go wrong, which was exactly the perspective Mason needed. He'd said he'd think about it seriously and meant it, which was what serious consideration looked like from someone who had recently had their employment end in ways they hadn't anticipated and who needed to be certain before committing to a new direction. Mason sat in the parking lot until practice ended, which was 90 minutes. He made 2 calls, one to the financial advisor, one to Patricia's colleague about the nonprofit structure, and spent the remaining time doing the specific mental work of building something new, which is mostly imagining problems and then imagining solutions, and then imagining the problems those solutions would create. It was not comfortable work, but it was absorbing, and when Callie appeared at the car window, still in her cleats and slightly out of breath, and with grass on her left knee, he had been so thoroughly inside his own thinking that her knock on the glass actually startled him. She found that very funny. "You zoned out for a full game," she said, getting in. "I was thinking." "About what?" "The new thing, the inspection service." She buckled her seatbelt. And I think I'm going to do it." He looked at her. "I think I have to, actually, because it needs to exist and I'm the person with the right background and the resources and the specific recent experience of what happens when it doesn't exist." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most decisive I've heard you be about anything in a while," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I know." "What changed?" He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the aircraft climbing south over the highway, gear up, climbing clean and safe into the clear Texas afternoon because someone had caught the thing that was wrong with it and said so when saying so was hard. He thought about Arlene finding a stress crack at 60% propagation in a Cessna wing spar that another shop had missed. He thought about David Carr trying to report something for 7 months with no one to report it to. He thought about the gap, the specific, costly, preventable gap between what was known and what was acted on, and about what it would take to close it, and about whether the people who needed to close it were going to find each other without some structure to find them through. "Nothing changed," he said. "I just stopped waiting to be ready." Callie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," in the way that meant she understood and was choosing not to make a whole thing out of it. He drove home through the early evening, and the Texas sky did its thing, the colors coming in from the west, that particular progression that people who live there stop seeing consciously after a while because it happens every evening and the ordinary eventually becomes invisible. But Mason had always been the kind of person who noticed it. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the same thing as stopping the truck at Bay 7, an instinct toward attention that he'd never been able to fully explain and had long since stopped trying to. He noticed it now, orange into amber into the deep blue that came from the east while the west was still burning. The first stars, just barely. The airport lights starting to come on along the perimeter, one by one, marking the edge of the field where the ordinary work of flight continued. Aircraft arriving and departing, fuel trucks moving, ground crews walking the line, maintenance crews doing the specific patient labor of keeping machines in the air, all of it quietly depending on someone doing the job right. He pulled into his street and parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment after the engine was off. The neighbor's dog was somewhere, not barking for once. A kid on a bicycle went by in the fading light, wobbling slightly, concentrating. The house was dark except for the kitchen light, which Callie had not turned off when she left that morning, which was a thing she always did and which he had entirely given up trying to change. He sat there and felt the specific texture of the moment. Not happy, exactly. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Something quieter than all of those. The feeling of a man who knows where he is and what he's for and what the next thing is and who has enough, not in excess, but genuinely enough to do it. That's the thing they don't tell you about the version of success that comes from doing the right thing in a hard situation. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like standing on solid ground. He went inside. He turned off the kitchen light that Callie had left on. He stood in the dark kitchen for a moment and listened to the house. The refrigerator, the air conditioner, his daughter upstairs moving around in her room, living her life. He went and checked on her, the way he always did. She was at her desk with her headphones on and 3 browser tabs open, and she pulled one ear cup back when he appeared in the doorway and said, "Dad, I'm fine." "I know," he said. "Then stop hovering." "I'm not hovering. I'm standing in a doorway." "That's hovering with extra steps." She put the ear cup back. He stood there one more second. Then he went to bed. He lay in the dark and didn't think about anything large or consequential. He thought about the alternator he'd replaced, about Torres finishing the Piper Annual by noon, which was fast, which meant Torres was getting better, about the office space he was going to need to find and the specific headache of negotiating a commercial lease, about Callie's left knee and whether the grass stain would come out in the wash, or whether it was going to be one of the ones that didn't, about the aircraft climbing south over the highway, small and then smaller and then gone, carrying whoever it was carrying toward wherever they needed to be, its systems working as designed, warning indicators intact, fuel flowing correctly through controllers that had been rebuilt by people who knew their work and cared about it. Safe, doing what it was built to do, because someone had paid attention. He closed his eyes. Outside, somewhere over the city, an aircraft moved through the dark on its heading, its navigation lights blinking red and white in the regular rhythm that meant, "I am here, I am moving, I am what I am," the oldest language of the sky, the one that predates everything else, the one that just means, "I made it, I'm still going." Mason Ryder slept.